The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it smelled like trouble. Edward Voss did not open it immediately. He set it on the corner of the long oak table in his private study, and stood at the window for a moment, watching the grounds below. The morning was gray. A light fog moved slowly across the eastern fields. 2 of his men were crossing the courtyard with a crate between them, walking fast, heads down. Everything on his estate moved with purpose. That was how he preferred it. He picked up the letter. It was from his advisor, a careful man named Aldous Crane, who had served the Voss family for nearly 30 years, and who chose his words the way a surgeon chose tools, precisely, and only what was necessary. Aldous did not write letters, unless the matter could not be handled with a simple message. The fact that he had written 2 full pages told Edward everything he needed to know before reading a single line. He read it anyway. The Bellow estate was in difficulty. That was the polite version. The longer version, spelled out in Aldous' neat handwriting, was that the Bellow family had spent 2 generations living at a level that their actual income could not support, and the resulting gap had grown into a quiet crisis that the family had managed, so far, to keep away from public knowledge. Lady Constance Bellow, 24 years old, unmarried, and the only surviving child of Lord Bellow, was now the central piece of every plan her family had to resolve the situation. She needed to marry well. She needed to marry soon. And the name that had risen to the top of the list of suitable candidates, according to Aldous, according to 3 separate social sources he had consulted, and according to the careful calculations of Lord Bellow himself, was Edward Voss, Duke of Marienfeld. Edward set the letter down. He was 31 years old. He had a title, a fortune, 2 estates, and a reputation for being difficult to read, which suited him. He also had 2 dead brothers, and that was the part that mattered most when he thought about marriage. His elder brother, Frederick, had died 4 years ago. The circumstances had been called a sudden illness, and Edward had allowed that explanation to stand, because proving otherwise would have cost more than he was willing to spend. But he knew what had happened. Frederick had married a woman named Alara Doust, a charming, sharp-minded woman from a respectable family, who had spent 3 years learning the exact shape of Frederick's weaknesses before she began to use them. The marriage had been miserable. Frederick's health had declined steadily, driven by stress and a kind of quiet despair that Edward had watched from a distance and not known how to stop. Alara had walked away from the marriage and from Frederick's death, with a settlement that had been agreed upon so quickly that Edward had not found out about it until after it was signed. His younger brother, Philip, had not died. He had simply been ruined. His wife, a woman named Cecily Hart, had borrowed against Philip's name, against his properties, against his future income, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been planning the operation for years. By the time Philip understood what was happening, the damage was deep enough that recovery was impossible. Philip now lived in a small house in the north, supported by Edward's money, and spent most of his days reading books and pretending to be content. He was not content. He was a man who had been hollowed out by someone who had smiled at him over dinner every night for 2 years. Edward had watched both of these things happen. He had watched them carefully and completely, and he had drawn a conclusion that he held with absolute certainty. A title and a fortune did not attract love. They attracted calculation. And the women who came looking for both were, more often than not, very good at making calculation look like warmth. So when Aldous Crane wrote to say that Lady Constance Bellow, sole heir to a struggling estate, was being positioned by her family as a match for Edward Voss, Duke of Marienfeld, Edward did not feel flattered. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever someone moved a piece on a board he had not agreed to play on. He wrote back to Aldous that evening. The letter was short. He was not ready to make a decision. He needed more information. And he wanted the information gathered in a way that involved no social calls, no formal introductions, and no telegraphed intentions. He would get it himself. Aldous replied within 2 days. His response was a single paragraph that managed to express deep concern, professional loyalty, and quiet resignation all at once. He had arranged for Edward to be placed at the Bellow estate as a temporary stable groom, beginning the following Monday. The regular groom had been quietly offered a generous sum to take an early extended leave. The estate manager, a man named Croft, who owed Aldous a favor he had been carrying for years, had agreed to ask no questions. The position would last as long as Edward needed it to. The name he would use was Wren. Aldous had added one final line at the bottom of the page, beneath his signature, in slightly smaller handwriting than the rest. It read, "I hope you find what you are looking for, and I hope what you find does not make you regret the looking." Edward read that line 3 times. Then he folded the letter, put it in the drawer with the others, and began to think about what a stable groom carried when he arrived somewhere new. He packed lightly, a few plain shirts, worn at the elbows, a pair of boots that he had broken in 2 years ago and kept for walks across the rougher parts of the south field, now scratched and weathered enough to look genuinely used, a heavy coat that had belonged to one of the estate workers who had left it behind one winter. He stood in front of the mirror in his dressing room the night before departure and looked at himself for a long time. The title disappeared faster than he expected, or rather, it did not disappear, but it stepped back. Without the fine cut of a coat made to measure, without the way people's eyes moved when he entered a room, he looked like a man, just a man, slightly broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and hands that were already roughened from years of riding and managing a working estate. He did not look like a duke. He looked like someone who worked outdoors and came home tired. That was exactly what he needed. He arrived at the Bellow estate on a gray Monday morning with a bag over his shoulder and a letter of introduction that Aldous had forged with his usual careful thoroughness. Croft, the estate manager, met him at the service entrance. He was a stocky man in his 50s, with a permanent squint that suggested he had spent too many years outdoors in bright sun. He looked Edward over once, handed him a set of work clothes, pointed him toward the stable block, and said, "The gray mare in the 3rd stall is your first problem. She's been favoring her left foreleg for a week, and nobody's been able to figure out why. Start there." That was the extent of the welcome. Edward found the stable block easily. It was well built, which was one of the first things he noted. The Bellow estate was struggling financially, but whoever managed this property had not let the physical structures decline. The fencing was maintained, the stable doors were sound, the stalls were clean. He made note of all of this without appearing to notice it, the way he made note of most things. The gray mare was exactly where Croft had said. She stood quietly, a calm, good-natured animal with kind eyes and a white blaze down her nose, and she was indeed favoring her left foreleg in the careful, deliberate way that horses do when something is hurting them, and they have learned that nobody is going to fix it immediately. Edward crouched down and ran his hands along the leg slowly, methodically, starting at the shoulder. The mare turned her head and watched him. She did not flinch. He worked his way down to the knee, and then lower, and found the problem. A small stone, wedged in the underside of the hoof in a spot that was difficult to see, and had clearly been missed by whoever had been checking the foot. He removed it carefully with the pick he found hanging on the stall wall, cleaned the area, and stood up. The mare put her weight back on the leg. She tested it once, then again, then she turned her head away, apparently satisfied, and went back to looking at the yard. "Good girl," Edward said, quietly, and meant it. He was settling the mare's water bucket when he heard footsteps, quick, purposeful ones, on the stable path. He did not look up immediately. He had learned long ago that the first time someone does not know they are being observed is often the most honest version of themselves. The footsteps slowed at the entrance to the stable block. A voice said, "Croft said we had a new man starting today." It was a clear voice, not loud, the kind that did not need to be loud because it was used to being listened to. Edward straightened and turned. Lady Constance below was not what the intelligence reports had suggested. The reports had described her as tall and dark-haired, which was accurate. They had described her as composed and self-possessed, which was also accurate. But the word the reports had used most often was strategic, as if her composure was a calculated thing, a tool she deployed. What Edward saw when he looked at her was someone whose composure came from a different place entirely. It was not the composure of a person performing confidence. It was the composure of a person who had simply decided, somewhere along the way, that most things were manageable if you stayed steady, and had never revisited that decision. She was wearing practical clothes, a dark skirt and a plain jacket, the kind of thing you wore when you had actual work to do and did not want to ruin anything better. Her hair was up, neatly but not formally. She was looking at him with a direct, unapologetic gaze that he was not entirely prepared for. "You must be Ren," she said. "Yes," he said. He kept his voice level. Easy. The voice of a man who introduced himself to employers every few months, and had long since stopped being nervous about it. "Just arrived this morning." She nodded. Her eyes moved to the gray mare, and whatever she had been about to say to him paused. She walked past him into the stall and checked the mare's foreleg herself, the same way he had done it, starting at the shoulder, working down. Her hands were confident and gentle. She knew what she was doing. "The stone is gone," she said, looking up at him. "Found it this morning," he said. "First stall, first look." She stood up and faced him, and there was something in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the way a person looks when something turns out to be better than they expected. "She's been limping for a week," she said. "3 people looked and missed it," he said, not unkindly, stating a fact. It was deep in the sulcus, easy to miss if you're not going slowly. There was a pause. He expected her to say something defensive, the way people in positions of authority often did, when someone below them pointed out a failure. She did not. She simply looked at the mare for a moment, then said, "Thank you. She's a good horse, and she deserved better than a week of walking uncomfortable." Then she looked at him again. "Welcome to the estate, Ren. Croft will show you where you're sleeping. The working day starts at 6. She left the stable block the way she had come, quickly, purposefully, without looking back. Edward watched her go. Then he turned back to the mare, who had gone back to her water bucket and was ignoring everyone. He had come here expecting to find what he was looking for within the first few days. A gesture, a telling remark, something that would confirm the version of Constance below that existed in the reports and in his own careful fears. He had been doing this long enough, watching people when they did not know they were being watched, that he usually found what he was looking for quickly. He found something else entirely, and it began in the first hour. The rest of that first day taught him things that the reports had not mentioned. He learned that she arrived at the stable block every morning before 7 o'clock, not to inspect but to check on the animals personally. He learned that she knew every horse by name and could describe the individual temperament of each one without hesitating. He learned that the stable hands, 2 young men, brothers, named Owen and Will, were easy around her, in a way that was not performing ease. They were genuinely comfortable with her. They did not straighten when she came in. They did not lower their voices when she passed. They spoke to her the way you speak to someone you trust, and she spoke back the same way. He learned that she had a habit of pausing at the door of the stable block before she left, always, and looking back once at the horses in their stalls, not to check anything. Just to look, like someone making sure the people she was responsible for were all right before she closed the door. He filed all of this away carefully. By the end of the first day, the portrait that the reports had given him was already showing cracks, not falling apart, just cracking, just suggesting that the picture was not complete. He sat in the small bunk room that evening, in the plain, clean space that Croft had assigned to him, and thought about his brothers. He thought about Frederick, who had believed in the warmth he was shown, because he was the kind of man who wanted to believe in warmth. He thought about Philip, who had trusted completely, and been answered by silence. He thought about the letter from Aldous, which he had not yet replied to, which sat in the inside pocket of his heavier coat, and which he would need to think about more carefully before he knew what to say. He thought about a woman who had found her mare limping for a week, and whose first response upon learning the problem was fixed was not relief for the inconvenience resolved, but something quieter and more genuine, something that sounded like she was sorry the animal had been uncomfortable and glad that it was not anymore. That was not what he had expected, but it was only one moment, and one moment was not enough. One moment was the kind of thing that could be performed, could be calculated, could be entirely accidental. He had seen people perform exactly the kind of warmth he was looking for, easily and at length. One moment meant nothing. He needed more time. He turned out the light and lay in the narrow bunk and listened to the sounds of the estate at night. The horses moving softly in their stalls, the distant bark of a dog, the wind in the trees along the north wall, and thought, 1 week. Give it 1 week and see what you find, then decide. He was asleep within minutes. The work was harder than he expected, and he was glad of it. He had managed his own estate for years, and he was not a soft man, but there was a difference between overseeing work and doing it. His hands hurt by the end of the second day, in ways that were specific and interesting. The left shoulder from lifting feed, the right hand from the pitchfork angle. He had a blister forming on the inside of his right thumb. He ate his meals in the small room off the kitchen with Owen and Will, who talked freely once they decided he was not strange. And he listened more than he spoke, and learned more that way than he would have any other way. He learned that Lady Constance ran the practical management of the estate entirely herself. Her father, Lord Below, was not well, not dangerously, but persistently. He had a problem with his lungs that had settled in over the past 2 winters and left him able to manage correspondence and meetings but not much else. Her mother, Lady Below, managed the household and the social obligations, which was its own considerable work. But the fields, the stables, the staff, the seasonal decisions, all of that was Constance. He learned that she had been doing it since she was 20, when her father's health first became serious. That was 4 years. 4 years of carrying the practical weight of an estate without the title or the formal authority. Because she was not the lord, and would not be, the estate would pass to a distant male cousin if she married, or revert to managed trust if she did not. She was doing the work and would receive none of the structural credit for it. He learned all of this from Owen and Will, who said it the way you say things that are so obvious, they barely seem worth mentioning. She keeps this place running, Owen said one evening, matter-of-factly, between bites of bread. Has done for years. Lord Bellow's a good man, but he can't manage the heavy work anymore. She does it. Does she mind? Edward asked, keeping his voice neutral, curious, a new man still learning. Owen looked at him, as if the question were slightly strange. It doesn't seem to, he said. She's good at it. That was all he said. He went back to his bread. Will was already on his way out the door. Edward sat with that for a long time. On the 3rd morning, before 6, before anyone else was in the stable block, he found that the gray mare had gotten worse again. The leg was swollen around the original site, not badly, but enough to worry about. He was already treating it when he heard the footsteps, and he already knew whose they were. She stopped at the stall. She looked at the leg, then at him. It came back, she said. Inflammation, he said. She probably knocked it in the night. I've started a cold compress. She'll need it changed every 2 hours today. She nodded. I'll send Will to help at midday. I can manage it, he said. She looked at him. It was the same direct, unapologetic look she had given him the first morning. He had the strange feeling, for a moment, that she was seeing something more than a groom crouched in a stall. Then it passed, and she was just looking at a horse's leg. All right, she said, but tell me if it gets worse. She stayed for a moment longer than necessary, running her hand along the mare's neck in a slow, quiet stroke. Then she left. He changed the compress 6 times that day. By evening, the swelling had gone down. The mare ate her hay with enthusiasm, which he took as a good sign. He told Constance when she came by at dusk. She crouched down and checked the leg herself, and when she straightened up there was something in her face that he had begun to identify, a small release of tension that she did not make any performance of, that she probably was not even aware of, that happened whenever something she was worried about turned out to be all right. Thank you, she said, simply. She's my father's horse, originally. He bought her as a foal and raised her himself, before he got ill. He doesn't come to the stables much anymore, but he asks about her every day. She said this quietly, without weight, without drama. It was just a fact. An ordinary fact about a horse and a man who loved her and could not visit as often as he used to. Edward said nothing. There was nothing to say. He nodded, because that seemed right. She left. He stood in the stall with the mare for a few minutes longer, in the quiet of the evening, and felt something shift in the careful machinery of his thinking. Not dramatically, not with any clear conclusion attached to it, just a small, subtle shift, like a door swinging open an inch. He was still watching. He was still waiting to find what he expected to find, but what he was finding, day by day, was different from what he had prepared himself for, and he was honest enough, at least with himself, in the quiet of a stable at dusk, to admit that he did not know what to do with that yet. By the 4th day, Edward had developed a routine that suited him. He rose before 5:30, which was earlier than even the most dedicated of the stable hands expected, and walked the perimeter of the stable block in the quiet dark before the estate stirred. He was not doing this because he had been asked to. He did it because it was the thing a genuinely conscientious worker would do, and also because he found it useful to observe a place at its most unguarded, before the day's performances began, before anyone had arranged their face for public consumption. The below estate was, in those early morning hours, genuinely beautiful. He had not expected that. The morning reports, the financial documents, the social assessments, none of them had mentioned that the gardens were tended with real care, or that the old oak trees along the south lane had been given enough room to grow wide and generous over a century, so that walking beneath them was like walking through a cathedral that nobody had built, just allowed to happen. He had noticed it on the first morning, and then noticed himself noticing it, which was slightly annoying. He was not here for the trees. But they were beautiful. On the fourth morning he was at the far end of the paddock when he heard her. Not her footsteps, she moved quietly, especially in the early hours. It was her voice, low and distinct, coming from the far corner of the yard. He did not make any motion toward the sound. He simply stilled, out of habit, and listened. She was talking to one of the old hands, a gray-haired man named Percy who looked after the yard chickens and the kitchen garden, and who did not, in Edward's brief experience of him, say a great deal to anyone. She was talking to Percy about the north fence section, which had a weak post that needed replacing before the ground froze. She had clearly already identified the post, already sourced a replacement, already spoken to the carpenter who would come on Thursday. What she was doing now was telling Percy about it in advance, because Percy managed that corner of the yard and would want to know, even though Percy's opinion was not required, and she was not asking for it. She was telling him because it was his corner and he deserved to know. That was all. Percy listened, asked a question about the depth of the post hole, got an answer, and nodded. He went back to his work. She went toward the stable block. Edward remained where he was for a moment, in the cold and the dark, and thought about that. She could have sent a message through Croft. She could have told the carpenter and considered it handled. There was no operational reason to walk to Percy's corner of the yard at 5:30 in the morning and tell him directly. It had no effect on the outcome. It was simply a small act of consideration toward a man who would not have known to expect it, and who would not have complained about its absence. Edward had met a great many people in his life who were excellent at performing consideration when an audience was present. He had met very few who practiced it at 5:30 in the morning in a cold yard while talking to an old man about a fence post. He filed it under the category of things he could not yet explain and walked back to the stable block. The morning's main work was exercising the 3 riding horses. The gray mare was still recovering, but the other 3 needed their regular movement. Edward rode the first 2 out along the eastern field path and back, a route he had learned in his first 2 days, letting the horses move at their own pace and feeling the rhythm of them, the way the land sloped and the way the morning opened up as the fog burned off. He was an excellent rider. He was careful not to be too excellent, because too excellent would be noticed and might be questioned. He rode competently, which was true, and slightly plainly, which was also true, if you stripped away the particular posture that came with years of riding at formal events. The third horse was different. His name was Percy, which Constance had explained the first morning was a coincidence. Percy the horse and Percy the yard hand had both been named in the same week 15 years ago, and nobody had thought to change either name, so they had simply lived with the confusion. Percy the horse was 12 years old, a dark bay with a narrow blaze, and the kind of quiet authority that came from a horse who had been well handled and well treated for every year of his life. He also, as Edward discovered in the first 5 minutes of the ride, had a strong opinion about direction, and was not shy about expressing it. He wanted to go left at the gate. Edward wanted to go right. This difference of opinion took several minutes to resolve, during which Percy the horse made his position clear, in a series of increasingly emphatic sideways steps. Edward held his course, not harshly, but firmly, because a horse that was allowed to win arguments at the gate became a horse that started more arguments. Eventually Percy the horse conceded the point, and went right. "You'll be all right," Edward told him, as they turned onto the path. "You've just been allowed to have too many opinions." "He does that with everyone," said a voice behind him. He turned. Constance had come through the small gate from the garden side of the yard. She was on foot, carrying a pair of gardening gloves, apparently on her way to do something else entirely, and had simply passed at the right moment. Or the wrong moment. He was not sure yet. He tests them, she continued, falling into an easy walk beside the horse. Not beside Edouard, but beside Percy the horse, her hand going up naturally to rest on the horse's neck as they moved. He used to do it with my father. Every morning, same argument at the gate. My father lost about half the time. What happened when he lost? Edouard asked. Percy the horse chose a very nice route, along the old mill path, that my father ended up liking quite a lot, she said, without particular emphasis, as if this were simply the natural conclusion of the story. Then, with the faintest hint of something that might have been amusement, but was held back before it became a smile. So, maybe Percy the horse had better judgment. She patted the horse's neck once, decisively, and turned back toward the garden gate. He tends left because the grass is better on the east side this time of year, Edouard said, before he could stop himself. He's not being difficult. He's being practical. She stopped. She turned back and looked at him. Not sharply, but with focus. The same focused look she gave things she was genuinely interested in. How do you know that? She asked. He kept his face easy. Horses don't argue without a reason, he said. You just have to understand the reason before you decide whether to argue back. She held the look for another second. Then she said, We've had 3 grooms in 2 years who couldn't figure that out. A pause. Where did you work before this? He had prepared for this question. He gave her the answer Aldous had constructed for him, a sensible, plausible, unremarkable history of work at 2 other estates in the north. Names that were real, managers who existed, easily checked if anyone bothered, impossible to disprove without a great deal of effort. He told it simply, without embellishment. She listened, nodded, and asked one question about the second estate that suggested she had some knowledge of that part of the country. He answered accurately, because that part was true. She seemed satisfied, or at least, she seemed to have gotten enough information to move forward, which was its own kind of satisfaction. She said, Get him to the East Meadow for half an hour. He'll be more cooperative after. She went back through the garden gate. He took Percy the horse to the East Meadow and let him graze for 30 minutes, while the sun came fully up, turning the fields from gray to gold. The horse pulled happily at the thick autumn grass and completely ignored Edouard, which was fine. Edouard sat on the fence rail and watched the estate wake up around him. What he was watching for, still, was the calculation, the moment where the performance slipped and he saw the machinery beneath. In his experience of people who were playing a long game, there was always a moment like that, a moment of impatience, a moment of careless cruelty to someone who could not fight back, a moment of treating an inconvenience as a burden to be resented rather than a problem to be solved. He had seen it in Alara, once, speaking to a servant in a corridor she thought was empty. He had seen it in Cecily Hart, once, in the way she had looked at Philip after an evening that had not gone to her plan, a brief, cold assessment, there and gone before Philip noticed it. Those moments were the truth. Everything around them was theater. He was looking for Constance Below's version of that moment. He found something else instead, on the afternoon of the 4th day, and it reset the entire frame of his thinking. There was a supplier who came every 2 weeks with feed and materials. He arrived that afternoon with a delivery that was wrong, 2 items substituted for what had been ordered, and not good substitutes. Edouard noticed this immediately. He was in the adjacent stall and could hear the conversation at the supply entrance, which he had not intended to overhear, but which he overheard anyway. The supplier, a broad man named Graves, with the manner of someone accustomed to not being challenged, explained the substitution briskly, without apology, with the air of a man who expected the explanation to be accepted. He said, "It's what we had. The original order wasn't available. Take it or sort it yourself." Edouard, out of sight, waited. There was a pause. Then Constance said, calmly, "We placed that order 3 weeks ago. The terms we agreed gave you sufficient time to source the correct items. This substitution is not what we ordered, and it is not acceptable," Graves said, in a tone that was not quite respectful. "It's what you're getting today." Another pause. Longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had not raised. It had not sharpened. It had simply become more precise, like a lens being brought slowly into focus. "Mr. Graves," she said, "I have done business with your family's firm for 4 years. In that time, I have been a reliable customer, who pays on the agreed date and does not cause difficulty. I am asking you to either return with the correct order within the week, at the agreed price, or to tell me now that your firm is no longer able to fulfill our contract reliably, in which case I will find a supplier who can. Either answer is acceptable. The substitution, and the manner in which you have presented it, are not. Silence. Then Graves said, in a different tone, I'll have the correct order out by Friday. Thank you, she said. I'll leave the substitution items here, and you can collect them when you come. He heard Graves go. He stayed in the adjacent stall, and did not move until the sounds of the supply entrance had been quiet for a full minute. What he had just heard was not the performance of authority. He had heard authority performed many times. He did it himself when he was being the Duke. Performed authority had a specific sound, a particular weight, a careful self-consciousness. What he had just heard from Constance below was something simpler and more fundamental. She had not been performing, she had simply been correct, and she had been willing to say so, plainly, without anger and without apology, and she had then moved on. He came out of the stall and went to the water trough, and found something uncomfortable happening in his thinking. He had spent 4 days looking for evidence that she was calculating, that her warmth was a performance, that the woman the reports described as strategic was using strategy in the way that Ilara and Cecily Hart had used it, as a substitute for honesty, as a vehicle for manipulation. What he kept finding instead was a woman who was simply good at managing things, and who managed them with a straightforwardness that had nothing to do with performance, and everything to do with character. The difficulty was that this was exactly what someone would look like if they were very, very good at the long game. He had to hold that possibility open. He was not ready to set it down, but he was beginning to find it harder to hold on to. That evening, for the first time since he had arrived, he sat down to write to Aldous. He did not write much. He said only that he was gathering information, that he needed more time, and that the situation was not as straightforward as the reports had suggested. He sealed the letter and left it for the outgoing post in the morning, and then sat in his small bunk room with the lamp turned low, and thought carefully about what he was actually doing here. He had come to test her, that was the plain truth of it. He had come dressed as someone else, in someone else's name, doing someone else's work, in order to observe a woman without her knowledge, and pass judgment on whether she was worthy of his trust. He had told himself this was reasonable. He had told himself it was necessary. He had told himself the stories of his brothers, and let those stories justify the plan. What he had not thought about, until now, was what he was asking of his own conscience if he was wrong about her. If she turned out to be exactly what she appeared to be, honest, capable, decent, unperforming, then what he was doing to her was a violation of something. He could not name it precisely. He was watching her, studying her, judging her, without her consent and without her knowledge. He was gathering information about a person who had given him no reason to distrust her, and every reason, in 4 days, to extend her the basic courtesy of honesty. He sat with that for a long time. He did not leave. He was not ready to leave, and leaving would have created more problems than staying. But he was honest enough, alone in the small bunk room with the lamp burning low, to admit to himself that what had seemed clean and reasonable in his study in Marienfeld felt considerably less clean now that he was inside it. He was watching someone who had done nothing wrong. He needed to hold on to that. He needed to make sure that whatever he concluded at the end of this, however this ended, he had been a fair witness, not a generous one, not an uncareful one, but fair. He turned the lamp out and lay in the dark and listened to the estate settle around him, and tried to locate the precise feeling that was growing somewhere in his chest that he did not have a comfortable name for yet. The 5th day was unremarkable, which was itself remarkable, because unremarkable days on a working estate were something you had to earn. A day in which nothing went wrong required that a dozen things that could have gone wrong had been managed in advance, quietly, by someone who was thinking ahead. Edouard spent that day paying attention to all the things that did not happen, and found them instructive. The water in the east paddock was fresh, because someone had arranged it. The delivery from the morning, correct this time, apparently Graves had telephoned ahead with confirmation, was stored properly, because someone had thought about where it needed to go. The young dog that belonged to one of the kitchen workers had gotten into the stable yard the week before, and startled 2 of the horses, and this morning there was a new latch on the garden gate that the dog could not operate. Every single one of these things could be traced back, if you looked, to Constance. He spent the evening sitting on the fence by the paddock and thinking about competence. Not warmth, not character, not honesty, just competence. The specific pleasure of watching someone who was very good at something do it as if it cost them nothing. It was a pleasure he allowed himself rarely, because in his world, competence was usually attached to ambition, which was attached to risk, which required assessment. But stripped of all of that, the plain fact of someone doing a thing well, in the quiet and without fanfare, was deeply satisfying to observe. He realized, sitting on the fence in the evening with the horses moving softly behind him, that he had not thought about Ilara, or Philip, or Frederick in 2 days. This was the longest gap in 6 years. He sat with that too. He did not know what it meant. He was not certain he was ready to find out. The conversation happened on the 6th morning, in the gray hour before the yard was fully awake, and it was the conversation that changed the shape of everything that came after it. Edward had been in the stable since 5, working through the early feeding routine, when the gray mare, now recovered, walking evenly, carrying herself with the relaxed confidence of an animal that was no longer in pain, began to show signs of something else. Not the leg. Something quieter. She was standing at the back of her stall with her head low and her ears turned slightly inward, which was not how she normally stood in the morning. In the morning, she was usually pressing her nose against the gate and watching the yard with lively interest. Today, she was turned away. He checked her temperature, her gums, her breathing. Nothing alarming, but something not right either. A horse that was not engaging with the world in the way it normally did was a horse worth watching. He was sitting on an overturned bucket outside her stall, watching her, when Constance arrived. She came in from the dark outside, still pulling on her jacket, clearly having come directly from the house rather than through her usual route via the garden. Her hair was not quite as neatly arranged as it normally was. She had been moving quickly. She stopped when she saw him sitting outside the stall and read the situation with the speed of someone who had spent years learning to read stables at a glance. "She's not right," Constance said. It was not a question. "Not dangerously," he said, "but she's withdrawn. I've been watching her for an hour. Nothing I can put my finger on yet." Constance went into the stall. She did not check the leg first. She knew the leg was fine. She went straight to the mare's head and put her hand against the side of the horse's face, very gently, and the mare turned slowly and looked at her. Something passed between them, in the way that something passes between an animal and a person who has known each other for a long time. Then the mare sighed, a long, slow exhalation that dropped her shoulders, and leaned her head, very slightly, into Constance's hand. Constance stayed still for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, without taking her eyes off the horse, "My father named her Bethany. He said it was the first name that came to him when she arrived, and he was always very firm about not overthinking first impressions." A pause. "She does this sometimes in autumn, withdraws for a day or two. We used to worry, the first few years, but she always comes back." Edward said nothing. He watched. "My father used to say she was thinking," Constance continued, in the same quiet voice. "I used to tell him that was ridiculous, that horses don't sit and think the way people do. He would say, 'How do you know?' I never had a good answer for him." She stroked the mare's neck slowly. The mare's eyes were half closed. "How is your father?" Edward asked. He used the casual tone of a man making conversation, nothing more. He asked because he was curious, and because the way she had said "my father" twice in the space of 20 seconds had a quality he could not ignore. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "He's managing. He has good days and less good days. The cold doesn't help." A pause. "He asked about Bethany yesterday, which is how I knew to check on her this morning. He still knows, somehow, when she's not herself. He can't come see her, but he knows." Edward thought about this. A man who was unwell, who could not come to the stables, who asked about his horse every day, and who still had some connection to that animal clear enough that he sensed when she was withdrawing. And a daughter who received that information and acted on it immediately, before sunrise, still pulling her jacket on. "You're close to him," Edward said. "Very," she said simply, without self-consciousness, without performing the sentiment, just stating a fact. "Does he know about the estate's difficulties?" He asked it very carefully, because it was the wrong question for a groom to ask, but he needed to know whether she was carrying this knowledge alone. She looked at him, not sharply, more with a kind of calm assessment, the way you look at someone who has asked something more perceptive than expected. He knows some of it, she said. He doesn't know all of it. He doesn't need to, and it wouldn't help him to. So you carry that, Edward said. She turned back to the mare. Everyone carries something, she said. This is what I carry. It isn't unfair. He sat with that. He was aware that he was pushing further than a stable groom had any right to push, and he was aware that she was allowing it, which meant she was either less guarded than she should be, or she was more trusting than most people he knew, or she simply found the conversation useful. He was not certain which. "Do you think you'll resolve it?" he asked. "The difficulties." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "If the match that's been arranged works out, then yes." It landed in the conversation like a stone in still water. The match that's been arranged. She had said it plainly, without drama, without embarrassment. A tool, a solution. She knew what the Duke of Marenfeld represented in her family's calculations, and she was not pretending otherwise. But then she said, and this was the part that would stay with him, "I don't resent it. I know it must seem like that's the only decent feeling about it, that you should resent being arranged. But I think, if the man is decent, a reasonable arrangement between two people who understand their circumstances is not the worst thing. It's only the worst thing if you go into it pretending it's something it isn't." She said this to the horse. She was not performing it for him. She was saying it because she was thinking it, and he was there, and she trusted him the way you trust someone who is present without threat. "And if he's not decent?" Edward asked. She smiled, very faintly, and it was the first smile he had seen from her that was entirely unguarded. It came and went quickly. "Then I suppose I'll have to make a different plan," she said. "I usually do." He had come into this conversation carrying a specific weight of suspicion, a specific frame through which he had been assessing everything he observed, and something happened in this conversation that he had not anticipated and could not reverse. The frame broke, not collapsed. He was still watching, still assessing, still carrying the knowledge that he was here, under false premises, and that caution was not optional. But the frame broke, in the sense that the picture inside it could no longer be reduced to what he had come here expecting to see. She was not calculating, she was clear-eyed. There was a difference, and it mattered enormously. A calculating person looks at an arrangement and thinks, "How do I extract the most from this, while giving the least?" A clear-eyed person looks at the same arrangement and thinks, "What is this actually, and can I live honestly inside it?" Constance Below was being clear-eyed. She knew what the match was for. She was not pretending it was a love story, and she was not treating it as a transaction either. She was doing the more difficult thing, which was looking at it straight. He was the one who was not being clear-eyed. He was the one, at this moment, with false premises in his pocket. He did not tell her then. He could not. Not in a stable, at dawn. Having been on the estate for 6 days, as someone else, the disclosure required more than a moment. It required a proper setting, a proper conversation, and a great deal more courage than he currently had access to. But the knowledge of what he owed her shifted permanently that morning. It went from being an abstract obligation, something he would handle eventually, to a concrete and specific thing, pressing and uncomfortable, that he was going to have to face. He stayed with the mare for another hour. Constance left, came back, left again. By mid-morning, Bethany had come back to herself. She was pressing her nose against the gate and watching the yard, ears forward, interested in everything, as if the whole episode had not happened, as if she had simply needed a morning to be inward, and now she was ready again. Constance came by at mid-morning to check. She saw the mare at the gate, and something in her expression released. That same quiet release of held tension that he had identified as her specific response to worry resolving. She looked at Edward over the gate. "Thank you for watching her," she said. "She's a good horse," he said. "She is," Constance agreed. Then, as she turned to go, "You're good with them. The horses. You see things other people miss." She said it without particular weight, as if it were simply an observation she was making, because it was true, and true things were worth saying. She was already turning away when she said it. It was, he realized, the most direct compliment she had given him. And it was given the way she gave everything. Plainly, without angle, without follow-through. Just set down and moved on from. He stood in the stable yard and felt it, strange and specific, like a small warmth in the middle of his chest that he was not accustomed to and did not know what to do with. On the 7th day, the household received official news. It came in the afternoon. Edward was in the feed room when he heard the change in the estate's mood. Not dramatic, but perceptible. A shift in energy that moved through a working household the way weather moved across open ground. He heard the name Marenfeld twice through the wall, spoken by women's voices he did not recognize, which meant it had reached the house staff. Owen confirmed it at supper. "Duke of Marenfeld's coming," he said, with the comfortable satisfaction of someone who finds other people's important events mildly entertaining. 2 weeks out, they're saying. Lady Bellow's in a state about the guest rooms. "Does Lady Constance know yet?" Edward asked, keeping his voice easy. "Sure she does," Will said. Lady Bellow told everyone at once, apparently. Drew everyone together in the front hall and made an announcement. Croft said Lady Constance just nodded and asked if there was anything the estate manager's office needed to prepare. "That's all?" Edward said. Will shrugged. "That's how she is. Doesn't make a production of things." He speared a piece of potato. Croft said Lady Bellow looked like she wanted more excitement about it. Lady Constance said she was sure the Duke was very distinguished, and she'd form a proper opinion when she met him. Edward ate his supper and did not say anything. He thought about that all evening. He thought about what it meant to know a person was coming to assess you for a potential match, to know that you were being evaluated, that your worth was being weighed against someone else's calculations, and to respond to that knowledge by asking whether the estate manager's office needed anything prepared. It was not coldness. It was the specific, practical orientation of a person who expressed anxiety, not by performing it, but by channeling it into the nearest useful task. He knew that orientation. He recognized it from the inside, because he did it too, though he had never had the self-awareness to identify it as such until this moment. He wondered, briefly, what she would think if she knew that the Duke of Marenfeld was already here, already in her stable yard, already eating supper with her stable hands and sleeping in her staff bunk, and watching her with the particular attention of a man who was looking for something specific and finding something entirely different. He put that thought away. There were things he could not afford to sit with yet. On the 8th day, the thing happened that stopped him completely in his tracks, that he had not planned for, that no amount of careful strategizing had prepared him for, because it was the kind of thing that happened between two people when neither of them was performing, and he had not expected to not be performing. He had come around the corner of the stable block in the early evening to find Constance sitting on the wooden bench by the water trough. This was unusual. She was not a woman who sat in the yard in the evening. She was always moving, always managing, always on her way to or from something. He nearly turned back. Instead, because she had already seen him, he walked the rest of the way across the yard and stopped at a reasonable distance. She was looking at the sky, which had gone rose gold in the west, streaked with thin cloud. She looked tired, not the ordinary tired of a long working day. She always looked that kind of tired, and it sat easily on her. This was something heavier. "The North Field," she said, without looking at him. "We've lost more yield this year than last. I've been working the numbers, and it's not good." He did not know why she was telling him this. He was a groom. The North Field had nothing to do with him, but she said it anyway. The way you say something to a person who is simply present, when you need to say it to someone, and they happen to be there. "How much?" he asked. She told him. The numbers were specific and accurate, and hearing them out loud, as he had not, in a very long time, heard estate numbers said by someone who was genuinely troubled by them, not performing trouble, not using them as leverage, just honestly worried, felt like being trusted with something real. "It can be recovered," he said, after a moment. "The North Field soil reads as depleted from where I've been walking it. Rotation would help, 2 seasons. She looked at him then. "You know about soil rotation?" He had said too much. He adjusted. "Grew up on a working farm," he said, which was not entirely false. His estate was a working farm, and he had grown up on it. Different crops, but same principle. She considered this. 2 seasons is a long time, if the other variables don't hold. "They might," he said. The arrangement. He stopped himself. The arrangement, she said, quietly, picking up the word he had stopped. She looked back at the sky. Yes, if it happens, 2 seasons is manageable. A pause. It's strange, isn't it, to have a thing that large, hanging on something as unpredictable as whether a man you've never met turns out to be decent. He said nothing. I don't mean the money, she said. I mean the rest of it, the years. You can plan for finances. You can work numbers and make adjustments and find paths forward. But you can't plan for what a person is. You just have to wait and see. She said this in the most ordinary tone, as if she were simply thinking aloud, as if the thought had simply surfaced, and she had said it because that was what the thought deserved. He was standing 4 feet away from a woman who was quietly trusting that the Duke of Marenfeld would turn out to be decent. He was standing 4 feet away from her, and he was the Duke of Marenfeld, watching her trust out loud, and he had not told her. The pressure of that was, for the first time, genuinely unbearable. Not abstractly uncomfortable. Specifically, physically, unbearable. He might surprise you, he said. His voice came out even. He did not know how. She looked at him. There was something in her expression he could not fully read. Not suspicion, not recognition, just a kind of quiet focus, as if she were paying more attention to him than usual, and was not sure why. Maybe, she said. She stood up from the bench, brushing off her skirt. Done with the conversation. In the practical way she was done with all conversations. Not abruptly, just completely. Good night, Wren. Good night, he said. She went back toward the house. He stood in the yard until the sky had gone from rose gold to blue-gray to dark, and the first stars appeared, and the horses settled for the night behind him, and he understood finally, standing in the cold with the weight of what he had done and what he had not done, pressing on him from both sides, that the question was no longer whether Constance Below was what she appeared to be. The question was whether he was. 2 weeks was the timeline Aldous had given. The Duke of Marenfeld was expected in 2 weeks. What this meant, in practice, was that the estate was about to enter the particular kind of controlled anxiety that descends on a household when an important guest is coming, and the household knows it. Edward had seen this from the other side many times, had arrived at estates where everything had been arranged and polished and positioned for his benefit, where the servants had been briefed, and the flower arrangements had been chosen, and the menus had been planned with a precision that would not be applied to any other fortnight of the year. He had always found it faintly suffocating. He was now inside it from the wrong end, and he found it instructive. The first thing that changed was Lady Below. He had not seen much of her in the first week. She was a presence in the main house, occasionally visible crossing the yard or directing one of the household staff, but not someone who came to the stables. She came now, twice in 2 days, speaking to Croft about the appearance of the yard and the state of the fence along the main approach. She was not unpleasant about it. She was simply operating at a higher frequency than normal, moving faster, speaking in shorter sentences, carrying in her bearing the specific tension of a woman who understood exactly what was at stake, and was managing that understanding through action. He observed her in the way he had learned to observe people, from the side, peripheral, without making his attention visible. She was not like her daughter. Lady Below's composure was achieved. You could see the effort, very faintly, at the edges of it. The slight tightening when a question was asked that she had not prepared for. The way her eyes moved when someone said something unexpected. The micro-moment of recalculation before she responded. She was good at this. She had been doing it for 30 years, but the machinery was visible, and once you could see it, you could not stop seeing it. Constance had no such machinery. Constance's composure was not achieved. It was simply where she lived. The difference was not judgment. Lady Below was managing a crisis through the tools available to her, which were social intelligence and careful presentation. That was legitimate and real, but it made the comparison stark, and the comparison made something clear to Edward that he had been circling for days without landing on. He trusted Constance, not as a conclusion he had reached through the careful analysis he had planned when he arrived, but as a fact he had simply found to be true, the way you find a thing you have been looking for and did not expect to locate so soon. He trusted her. She was the kind of person you trusted, Not because she was sweet or smooth or practiced in the arts of being trusted, but because she was honest in the specific way that mattered. She was the same person in the stable yard at dawn as she was in the supply entrance facing down Graves the delivery man, as she was in the evening light, tired, saying out loud that she could not plan for what a person was. He had not trusted anyone easily in 6 years. He had not let himself. He had watched his brothers' lives crack open, and he had drawn the sensible conclusion that trust without evidence was not trust. It was hope wearing trust's clothes. He had spent 6 years applying careful scrutiny to everyone who came close enough to matter. He had spent 8 days with Constance below and found more evidence of trustworthiness than he had found in 6 years of scrutiny applied to the people his position attracted. He was not sure what to do with that. He was not sure whether it changed his plan, or complicated it, or simply confirmed it. He sat with the knowledge quietly, the way you sit with something large. On the 9th day, something happened that he had not planned for, and could not have planned for. He was in the feed room in the afternoon when he heard raised voices from the main yard. Not shouting, nothing that alarming, but voices at a pitch that suggested a disagreement of some kind, carried clearly through the open window of the feed room. He came to the window and looked out. Constance was in the yard, speaking to a man he had not seen before. Tall, well-dressed in the way of city visitors, carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone who owned things and was accustomed to that fact being known. He was not a supplier. He was not an estate worker. He was someone who had arrived at the main gate and come around through the yard, which was already an odd choice. Edward listened. The man was named Gable. He introduced himself as a friend of Lord Below's from the city, passing through the area and dropping in to pay his respects. He said this in a tone that was friendly on the surface and not quite friendly underneath, the tone of a man who is stating a version of the truth and knows it is not the complete version. He asked after Lord Below's health and said he hoped the old man was managing. He said the estate looked well maintained given the circumstances. Given the circumstances. He said those 3 words the way a certain kind of person says things, carelessly, as if it were simply an observation, but with enough deliberate weight that the person he was speaking to would feel them land. Constance heard them land. Edward could see it in the slight stillness that came over her, the way a pond goes perfectly still a second before rain hits the surface. She said, evenly, "The estate is well maintained because we maintain it. If you're here to see my father, I'll let him know you called. He's not receiving visitors today." Gable smiled. It was the smile of a man who has made his point and is satisfied. Of course, he said warmly. "Give him my regards. Tell him Gable sends his best and is thinking of him." A pause. "And, Lady Constance, I do hope the arrangement that's been spoken of in certain circles comes through well for you. It would be good to see the estate on surer footing." He said arrangement the way you say something when you want the other person to know that you know, that the information is not secret, that it is in certain circles, that it is being watched. Constance said, "Thank you for coming, Mr. Gable." She stood exactly where she was until he had gone back through the gate. Then she turned, and for a single unguarded second, Edward saw her face before she rearranged it, and what he saw was not distress. It was something harder and quieter than distress. It was the expression of a person who has been reminded that their private situation is public knowledge, and who finds that reminder unpleasant in the specific way of someone who has very few defenses against it. Then she rearranged her face and went back toward the house. He stayed at the window of the feed room for a long time after that. What had just happened to her was a specific kind of unkindness, the kind that performs itself as social engagement while delivering a message that is nothing of the sort. Gable had come to check on the situation, to see how thin the ice was, to remind her that people were watching the family's difficulties from a comfortable distance. He had done it with a smile and a pleasant tone, and the social plausibility of a friend paying his respects, which meant she could not push back against it effectively without seeming unreasonable. Edward had seen this particular mechanism used many times in his own world. He had probably deployed it himself, though he liked to think not in that particular form. He had watched people use the gentle social reminder as a way of pressing on a bruise while maintaining the appearance of concern. It was a specific social cruelty, and it was effective precisely because the person on the receiving end could not call it what it was without appearing to overreact. What he had not seen before was someone receive it the way Constance had received it, without collapse and without performance. 1 second of genuine expression. He had caught it only because he had been watching carefully. And then the rearrangement, and then forward, into the next thing. Not hiding it, not performing courage over it, just moving. He thought about the evening before, when she had said she could not plan for what a person was. He thought about the letter in his coat pocket from Aldous, which said the Duke of Marenfeld would arrive on the designated date, and which Edward had not yet replied to with any updated information. He thought about the things he knew about her now, the things he had learned in 9 days of quiet observation, and he thought about what she did not know about him. He went back to the stable. He did the evening work mechanically, his mind somewhere else. Owen and Will were discussing something about a horse fair in the neighboring town, and he answered their questions without tracking what they were. He ate his supper without tasting it. He sat in the bunk room after and looked at the wall. He was going to have to tell her. He had known this for 3 days in the general sense, but tonight it was specific and present and no longer deferrable. Not because of a logical decision point, because of Gable. Because of the look on her face in the moment before she rearranged it. Because the thought of arriving on the estate in 2 weeks as himself, walking through the formal entrance, and standing across from her in the drawing room while she offered him careful courtesy, and he knew everything he knew about her, while she knew nothing. The thought was suddenly intolerable. He was not a man who used the word intolerable lightly. He used it precisely. There were things he could not tolerate, and this had become one of them. The mechanism of how to tell her was the difficult question. He could not simply walk up to her in the yard and say, "I am not a groom. I am the Duke of Marenfeld, and I have been observing you for 9 days under a false name." That was not a sentence that could be delivered in the yard. He needed a setting that gave her room to respond properly, to be as angry as she had the right to be, to ask what she needed to ask, to decide how she felt without an audience and without pressure. He also needed time to think about what came after, because if he told her, everything changed. The clean boundaries of the experiment dissolved. The arrangement that her family had structured around the expectation of a formal meeting between strangers became something much more complicated. She would know him already, in a way that no formal meeting could replicate. She would know him and he would know her, and they would both have to decide what to do with that knowledge. He thought about her saying, "I think, if the man is decent, a reasonable arrangement between 2 people who understand their circumstances is not the worst thing." He thought about whether he was decent. He lay in the narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about Frederick, about the cheerful, eager way Frederick had opened himself up to a marriage and found something inside it that steadily closed around him, about Philip, who had trusted completely and been answered with silence. He thought about the careful mechanism he had built around himself in 6 years, the testing and the watching and the holding back, and he thought about what that mechanism had cost him, quietly, in the years when he had been very good at being cautious and very alone in being so. He thought about a woman sitting on a bench by a water trough at the end of a long day, looking at a rose-gold sky, saying plainly that she could not plan for what a person was, and that you just had to wait and see. She had not been saying it to him. She had no idea she was talking to the person she was waiting to meet. But the words were still there, in the air, undeniable. He got up at some point before dawn. He was not sure when. He sat at the small table in the bunk room with a piece of paper and wrote 3 different versions of a letter to Constance below, each of which he destroyed before finishing. The first was too formal. The second was too explanatory. Too many sentences that began with, "I wanted you to know," which was the kind of phrase used by people who were not actually sure they wanted you to know anything. The third got as far as 2 sentences before he recognized that he was writing around the thing he needed to say rather than toward it, and stopped. He pushed the paper aside and sat for a long time. What was the thing he needed to say, stripped of its performance and its management and its careful language? He had come here because he did not trust. He had found something that altered his understanding of trust. He owed her the honesty of that, and he owed her the chance to respond to it without the additional complication of a formal arrangement already in motion. That was the thing. Reduced to its simplest form, that was it. The question was whether he could say it before the arrangement moved further, or whether he had already waited too long. He sat at the table until the window lightened, and then he put on his coat and went to the stable, because the horses needed their morning, and his thinking was not getting clearer by sitting still. The Bethany was at the gate, watching the yard, ears forward, completely recovered. She pressed her nose against his hand when he reached in to check on her. He stood there for a moment, letting her, and thought, she is her father's horse, and her father loves her. And there is a man in a house 40 meters away who asks about this horse every day, because she is important to him. None of this is transactional, none of this is performance. This is simply what it looks like when things are real. He knew, standing in the early morning by a horse's warm nose, what he was going to do. He was going to tell her, before the 2 weeks were up, before the carriage arrived, before the formal meeting was staged and she had to stand in her drawing room and pretend she was meeting him for the first time. He was going to tell her, and he was going to do it properly. And whatever came after, whatever she decided, whatever she felt, whatever the consequences were for the arrangement, and for both their families, and for the very careful plan he had constructed over 6 years, that was going to be what it was going to be. He started the feeding routine. Outside, the yard was lightening slowly toward a clear autumn day. 2 days, he told himself. He would give himself 2 days to find the right moment and the right words. 2 days was enough. He was not sure whether he believed that, but it was the only timeline that felt honest. He did not find the right moment on the first day, because the first day did not give him one. It was one of those working days that accumulates its obligations before you have a chance to step back from any of them. A delivery that arrived wrong again and had to be sorted, a fence panel in the east paddock that had come loose overnight and needed immediate repair, and a message that came through Croft in the afternoon, saying that 2 additional guests were expected at the house the following week, as advance preparation for the Duke's visit. Preparation for preparation. The estate had kicked into a higher gear. He worked the day and watched the day and found no opening, no moment in which the conversation could be what it needed to be, and went to bed in the bunk room that night, feeling the pressure of his own delay, like a weight pressing behind his sternum. He slept poorly and was in the stable before 5. On the second day, the moment came, and it arrived so unexpectedly that he almost missed it. He had been watching her for 10 days. He had developed an understanding of her rhythms, when she moved fast and when she moved at half speed, when she was available for conversation and when she was elsewhere in herself, occupied with the internal management of something she was not sharing with the yard. He had learned to read the difference between her purposeful stride and the slightly slower, more deliberate walk she had when she was thinking through a problem. He had learned that she came to the stables later on days when her father had a difficult night, because she would have been up part of the dark hours and needed more morning. He had learned her the way you learn a person when you are paying the specific attention of someone who finds them important. The moment came at midday, during a gap in the work. He had finished the noon feed and was cleaning the implements in the back room when she came through the stable block looking for something she had left the previous day, a small notebook she used for estate tracking, which was always with her, and which she had apparently set down somewhere during the morning's work. He found it on the bench beside Bethany's stall, where she had been checking the mare's leg. He went to the door of the feed room with it. She was alone. The yard was quiet. Owen and Will had gone to the far field for a fence repair. Croft was in his office. The kitchen sounds were distant. There was no one else. She turned when she heard him. "Your notebook," he said. She came forward and took it, and for a moment they were standing at a normal conversational distance, close enough for low voices, close enough for truth. "Thank you," she said. He did not make himself say it immediately. He did not rush. He took a breath and said, "I need to tell you something." The change in his voice was slight, but she heard it. He saw it register, not alarm, just attention. She looked at him with the focused look she gave things that required her full consideration. She did not speak. She waited. "I'm not a groom," he said. A beat. 2. She did not look confused. She looked, very carefully, completely still. He continued, because stopping now would be worse than not starting. "My name is Edward Voss. I hold the title Duke of Marenfeld. I am the man your family has been in contact with regarding a match." He kept his voice steady, even, stripped of performance. He owed her that. "I arranged this placement through my advisor in order to observe the estate and its people before making any formal decision. I have been here 11 days. 11 days. He heard how it sounded as he said it. She was very still. Her expression was something he had not seen from her before. Not anger, not hurt, not confusion, just a profound and focused stillness, the kind that happens when a person is processing something very large and is doing it entirely on the inside. He gave her the silence. She looked down at the notebook in her hands for a moment, then she looked back up. "How many people knew?" she asked. Her voice was exactly what it always was, clear, not loud, giving nothing away. "My advisor, the estate manager, Croft." "No one else." "Croft knew," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." She nodded, once, as if putting that piece in its place. Then, "Owen and Will?" "No. Genuinely no." She absorbed this. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked. "Rather than arriving in 2 weeks as yourself and saying nothing?" He had thought about how to answer this. He had thought about it for 2 days. He said, "Because that would require you to pretend, in front of me, that you were meeting me for the first time. And I would be pretending the same thing, and I am not willing to begin a conversation about something that might matter for the rest of both our lives, with a pretense we have both agreed to maintain." The silence after that was different from the silence before it. It had weight. It had the weight of something genuine, being received by someone who was genuinely taking it in. "You were watching me," she said. "Yes." "To determine whether I was trustworthy." "Yes." "Because of your brothers." She said it plainly, not as an accusation, not as a surprise. He understood immediately that she had done her own reading, that a woman whose family was navigating a match with a duke would know what was available to know about that duke's history. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He let her. He owed her that too. What he could not tell, looking at her face, was what she was going to do. He had no read on it. In 10 days of careful observation, he had built up a reasonable understanding of her emotional landscape. What moved her, what steadied her, what she let land, and what she turned away from. But this was new territory. This was something he had done to her, and she was the only person who knew what it felt like from the inside. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. He considered the question carefully, because she deserved a careful answer. "No," he said. "I found something different." She looked at him. "I went looking for evidence that my fears were justified," he said. "What I found was evidence that they weren't. That is not the same thing as finding what I was looking for." The faintest thing crossed her expression, not softening exactly. Not yet. More like an acknowledgement that the words had arrived and were being considered. Then she said, "You sat here for 11 days and watched me, and said nothing. You heard things I said. You heard things I said to animals that I didn't expect anyone to hear." "Yes. That's a significant thing to do to a person." "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked down at the notebook again. She was quiet for long enough that he had to resist the urge to fill the silence, which was considerable. He held it. She was thinking, and she deserved the space to do it. "I need you to go," she said finally. She looked up. Her voice was perfectly even. "Not from the estate. Not yet. I need you to go back to whatever you were doing and let me think." "Of course," he said. He moved to go. At the entrance of the stable block, she said, "Wren." He turned. She looked at him steadily. "Did you actually find the stone in Bethany's hoof, or was that orchestrated to make a good impression?" He held her gaze. "I found the stone," he said. "I found it because I was doing the work." She looked at him for another second. Then she turned away and went toward the main house, and he stood in the entrance of the stable block and watched her go, and felt, with complete clarity, that the next hours were entirely outside his control, and that this was exactly as it should be. He went back to work. He did not go well, but he went. He occupied his hands with the things that needed doing and let his mind do what it was going to do, which was circle the conversation and test it from every angle, the way you test new ice before you walk on it. He had told her. That was done. What she did with it was not his to manage. Owen and Will came back at mid-afternoon, talking about the fence they had repaired, and he nodded and responded and was not present in any way that they noticed. Croft appeared at 3 o'clock. He stood at the entrance to the stable block and looked at Edouard with the resigned expression of a man who has just been told something uncomfortable and is managing his response to it. She spoke to me, Croft said simply. I know, Edward said. What would you like me to do? Croft asked. Nothing, Edward said. You've done what was asked of you. Whatever happens next is between her and me. Croft looked at him for a moment, with the long, assessing look of a man who had spent 30 years in service and had seen a great many things he was not paid to have an opinion about. Then he nodded and went back to his office. Edward led the horses out for their afternoon exercise, one by one, and thought about the conversation in the feed room doorway, and specifically about the last question she had asked him. He had not expected it. He had expected anger, or hurt, or the kind of cold, careful withdrawal that people used when they were managing their dignity. He had not expected, did you actually find the stone in Bethany's hoof, or was that orchestrated to make a good impression? It was the right question. It was the question that cut straight to the center of the thing. Not what did you do, but what was true. She had not asked whether his presence was deceptive, which she already knew. She had not asked whether the arrangement was uncomfortable for her, which she knew too. She had gone straight to, was the work real? He had answered honestly, I found it because I was doing the work. That was the truth. The work had been real. His attention had been genuine. He had not been playing a character. He had been himself, doing the same things he would have done anywhere. The deception was in the name and the position, not in the person. He thought about whether she would see it that way, and he decided that she would eventually, if she was given room and time to reach her own conclusions, and that the worst thing he could do now was press. So he did not press. He finished the afternoon, ate his supper, and went to the bunk room. He sat at the small table and did not write anything. He looked at the wall and felt the specific texture of waiting for something that mattered. Heavier than he had expected, but not intolerable in the way he had feared. Whatever she decided, whatever she chose, he had told the truth. That was the part he could control, and he had controlled it. He slept, eventually. He did not expect to, but he did. She did not seek him out the next morning. He understood that, and did not look for her. He did his work, kept the space between them, and watched from the yard as she moved through the estate with her usual efficiency, slightly less visible than usual, which was her way of taking back room that had been occupied by something unwelcome. By late afternoon of the day after the conversation, he was beginning to think she had made her decision, that she would simply let the time pass, and the announcement would come, and everything would proceed as arranged, and neither of them would ever acknowledge what had happened in the doorway of the stable block. He would become the Duke of Marenfeld again. She would become Lady Constance Belleau. The arrangement would go forward or not, on whatever formal terms were eventually agreed upon, and this 11-day interval would be a thing that neither of them referred to in any way that mattered. He was not prepared for how much that possibility cost him. He was standing at the gate of the east paddock, watching Percy the horse conduct his usual end-of-afternoon survey of the fence line, a habit the horse had that involved walking the full perimeter in a specific pattern, checking each section with his nose, as if conducting a professional audit, when he heard her behind him. He turned. She was standing a few feet away. She had come from the direction of the house, not the yard, which meant she had come deliberately, not passed by. She was wearing her everyday clothes, and her expression was the same focused, unapologetic expression she always wore. But beneath it, there was something that had shifted slightly. Something she was carrying forward rather than back, if that made any sense. He thought it made sense. I've been thinking, she said. I know, he said. It's a complicated thing to think about, she said. What you did. I know that too. She looked at the paddock. Percy the horse had reached the far corner and was applying rigorous olfactory attention to a fence post. She watched him for a moment. There's a question I keep arriving at, she said, and I can't get past it. Ask it, he said. She looked at him. The person you were being, here, Wren, is that actually you? He considered the question with the care it required. In almost every way that matters, he said. The name was false. The position was arranged. Everything else was as close to myself as I know how to be. She was quiet, absorbing this. I don't perform well, he continued. I've tried, at various points, and I'm not good at it. What you've seen for 11 days is the person I actually am when I am doing work that I know, and doing it for reasons I understand. A pause. The only thing I was hiding was the title. The title is not a small thing, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at the horse again, and he waited, and the evening settled around them in the specific golden way of autumn evenings, and Percy the horse completed his fence audit, and came back to the center of the paddock and stood there like a satisfied inspector. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. I knew, she said. Not at first, not for the first several days, but I knew before you told me. The stillness that came over him was complete. The hands, she said. The way you stand near horses, and the soil rotation. A groom who grew up on a working farm might know the theory. But the way you said it, the specific confidence, that's not theory. That's someone who has read the numbers from his own land. She looked at him, steady. I've been managing an estate for 4 years. I recognize the specific kind of knowing that comes from having actual authority over a piece of ground. He said, When did you know? Day 8, she said. The evening when I told you about the North Field. Day 8. She had known for 3 days before he told her, and she had said nothing. He understood, in that moment, the exact weight of what she had just handed him. She had known. She could have confronted him. She could have gone to Croft. She could have sent a message to Aldous and ended the arrangement entirely, with full justification. Instead, she had sat on the bench by the water trough and talked about the North Field, and she had let him find his own way to honesty. She had given him the chance to tell her himself. He did not have words for what that meant. He did not have a word for the specific thing he felt, standing at the gate of the east paddock in the autumn light, understanding what she had done. But whatever the word for it was the largest thing he had felt in years. Larger than he had known, was still available to him. Why, he said. His voice came out differently than he intended. He cleared it. Why didn't you say something? She looked at him with the unapologetic directness he had come to know as simply her way. Because I wanted to see if you would, she said. That was the only thing that was going to tell me what I needed to know. The light was gold, and the horse was still, and the answer was in front of him, and he had nothing to say to it, except the truth. And, he said. And you did, she said simply. 11 days, but you did. She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him standing at the paddock gate, with Percy the horse, watching him from the field, ears forward, as if he had followed the conversation and found it satisfactory. She had known. He turned this over for the rest of that evening, and through the night and into the next morning, the way you turn a stone over in your hand when you cannot quite account for its weight. She had known. 3 days before he told her, she had sat beside him at the water trough and talked about the North Field and said she could not plan for what a person was, and she had known who the person was, and she had said it anyway and let him find his own way forward. He did not sleep especially well, but the sleeplessness was a different kind than the previous nights. It was not anxious. It was something closer to alert, a wakefulness that came from knowing a thing had changed and not yet understanding the full shape of the change. He lay in the narrow bunk and tracked the sounds of the estate at night and thought about what it meant to be given a chance that you had not earned and had not asked for. She had given him the chance to be honest. That was what she had done. She had known the truth and held it quietly and waited, not to catch him, not to use it, but to see whether he would choose the honest path without being pushed toward it. And when he had chosen it, 11 days in, which was longer than it should have been, she had said, "You did," as if that were enough. He did not know whether it was enough. He did not know what came next. He did not know whether she had forgiven him or was still deciding, or had decided something he did not have access to yet. What he did know was that she had done something for him that he had not done for her, and that the imbalance was something he was going to need to address. He thought about Frederick. He thought about it carefully and completely, the way he had not allowed himself to do in several years. Frederick had opened himself up and been met with something that used his openness against him. The lesson Edward had taken from Frederick was, do not open up. The lesson he had been applying for 6 years was, keep the door closed, check carefully before you consider any other arrangement. He was sitting with the possibility, in the dark of the bunk room, that the lesson was wrong. Not completely. Caution was not wrong. The mechanism of going slowly, of watching before trusting, of wanting evidence before committing, none of that was wrong. What was wrong was the assumption he had built into the mechanism, that the person he was protecting himself from was the same as the person he was protecting himself from showing himself to. That vigilance against being used was the same as vigilance against being known. They were not the same. He had confused them for 6 years. Constance Below was not Ilara. She was not Cecily Hart. He had known that by day 4, if he was honest. He had continued the deception past the point of genuine uncertainty and into the territory of habit, the habit of keeping the door closed, the habit of maintaining the controlled distance that felt like safety and was, in fact, just distance. She had seen it, and rather than confronting it or retreating from it, she had waited to see whether he could move past it himself. He got up before 5, as he always did, and went to the stable. Bethany was at the gate, watching. He checked her leg. Perfect, no swelling, no tenderness, and stood with her for a while in the dark. She put her nose against his shoulder and breathed slowly, the deep, easy breath of an animal that is completely at rest. He thought about the next 2 weeks. He thought about the structure of the situation that remained. The formal visit was still planned, the arrangement was still in motion, and whatever had shifted between them in the last 36 hours existed privately, known only to 2 people, and not yet known to anyone who needed to know it. He was still technically a groom named Wren. That fiction had not yet been resolved. He was not sure when or how it would be, and he was very aware that he was not the only person who got to decide. She appeared at the stable block at her usual time. She came in through the main entrance, checked on Bethany the way she always did, and then stood at the gate of the stall and looked at him with the same steady, focused look. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She looked at the mare for a moment. "She's well today." "Yes," he said. A pause, not an uncomfortable one, a settling one. "I told my mother this morning," she said. He went still. "Not everything," she said. "I told her that the Duke of Marenfeld had arrived informally, ahead of the scheduled visit, to see the estate without ceremony. I told her he would be presenting himself formally in a few days." She looked at him. "I didn't tell her about Wren." He understood, after a moment, what she had given him again. She had explained it to her household in a way that covered the gap without requiring the whole story. She had not lied. She had framed it as an informal early arrival, which was technically accurate, and she had left the more complicated history for the conversation that would need to happen eventually, in the right setting, between the right people. She had managed the situation. She had done it the way she managed everything, clearly, without drama, with a practical orientation toward what needed to be handled and a quiet setting aside of what did not need to be handled yet. "Your mother," he said. "How did she respond?" A tiny thing crossed Constance's face. "Considerably," he said, with a kind of dry precision that it took him a moment to recognize as humor. "She has a great many opinions about the guest rooms." He felt something shift in his chest, lighter than what had been sitting there since the evening before. "I'm sorry to have created a complication for her," he said. "The guest rooms were going to be a complication regardless," Constance said, and that was definitely humor now, dry and contained but present. They stood in the stable in the early morning quiet, and she did not press him for anything, and he did not try to resolve anything, and it was, he recognized, the same quality of ease that had been there in all the morning conversations they had had. The specific ease of 2 people who happened to find each other's presence useful rather than requiring. He had not had that with anyone in 6 years. He was not sure he had ever had it in exactly this form. "When did you decide to wait?" he asked. "When you knew. What made you decide to let it run rather than confront it?" She considered the question seriously. "I was angry for a day," she said. "On day 8, when I was sure. I was angry because it was a real thing you had done, and it deserved a real response." A pause, and then I thought about what the alternatives were. I could confront you. I could tell Croft to have you removed. I could send a message to your advisor and cancel the arrangement. She paused again, thinking through the options she had genuinely weighed, but I kept coming back to one thing. "What thing?" he said. "The stone," she said. "In Bethany's hoof. On your first morning. Nobody asked you to be in that stall at 5 o'clock. Nobody had given you instructions about the mare. You just did it, because she was uncomfortable and you noticed, and you knew how to help." She met his eyes. "You can stage a meeting. You can stage a conversation. You can arrange a very good impression in a formal drawing room. You cannot stage a 5 o'clock decision to go and help an uncomfortable animal when there is nobody watching. He was quiet for a moment. That's what you decided to trust, he said. That's what I couldn't dismiss, she said. There's a difference. He thought about the difference. She was right. Trust and inability to dismiss were not the same thing. She had not been naive about this. She had been empirical. She had found a piece of evidence that could not be performed, and she had held it against the deception, and weighed them, and the evidence had been heavier. I'm going to tell you something, he said. He said it carefully, because it was something he had not said to anyone in a very long time, and he wanted it to land accurately. My brothers, both of them, were hurt by the situations I told you about, and the lesson I drew from that was a lesson about protecting myself. I've been operating from that lesson for 6 years. He paused. What I found here, in 11 days, is that I've been applying it incorrectly. I was protecting myself from the wrong thing. She listened without moving. I came here to look for calculation, he said. I was looking for evidence that the warmth was a performance, that the clarity was strategy, that the consideration was deployed rather than genuine. He said each thing plainly, without softening it, because she deserved to know exactly what had been going through his mind. What I found was that you are what you appear to be, and then I had to sit with the fact that I had spent 11 days studying that truth from behind a false name, which is not what an honest person does. No, she said, simply, without accusation. It isn't. I know. She held his gaze. There was something in her expression that he had seen once before and not known how to name. Not quite forgiveness, not quite acceptance. Something between them that was more active than either. Something like, I can see what this is, and I am deciding what to do with it. My father will want to meet you, she said, after a moment. As yourself. He's heard a great deal about you. About the title, about the estate, about the family history. He'll want to form his own opinion of the actual person. I would welcome that, Edward said, and meant it. He's not well, she said. He tires easily, but he's sharper than people expect, and he has a good sense of people, always has. A pause, and in the pause, something private and fond. He's going to ask you about Bethany. I'll have good things to report, Edward said. She looked at the mare for a moment. Then she said, There's one more thing. Yes, he said. The situation between our families, the arrangement. It remains what it is. My family needs this to go forward, and I understand that, and I'm not pretending otherwise. She said this with the same clear-eyed directness she had used when she had explained the arrangement to a stable groom she thought she was talking to. But I am not going to go forward with it, as if the last 11 days didn't happen. Whatever is agreed has to be agreed honestly. Yes, he said. That's what I want too. She studied him. Is it? It is, he said. I came here to test whether I could trust what I couldn't see yet. I found I trust it. The only thing left is whether it goes anywhere, and that's a conversation that deserves to happen between two people who are actually who they say they are. The morning light was coming through the stable door, slow and clear, settling across the hay and the horses and the practical, unremarkable world of the yard. Bethany pulled at her hay contentedly. Percy the horse, 2 stalls down, was engaged in his morning opinions about something. How long do you need, she asked, to actually become the Duke of Marenfeld again? He thought about the carriage that was waiting in the village, 2 miles down the road, on Aldis's quiet arrangement. He thought about the change of clothes that were there, and the letter to Aldis that he still owed, and the formal presentation that would need to happen before the household and the family, and all the careful machinery of arranged things. 2 days, he said. If that's acceptable. She considered. 2 days, she said. And then you come through the main entrance, and we meet formally, and I will be as surprised as anyone would expect. A pause. I'm not an especially skilled performer, but I can manage that. He thought about the question she had asked him the first morning. Did you actually find the stone, or was that orchestrated? He thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by a person who then continued forward anyway. You won't have to perform for long, he said. I intend to be entirely obvious. Something shifted in her expression. Not the faint, almost smile he had seen a few times. something more genuine than that, which she did not quite let arrive before she turned back to the mare. "I'll look forward to it," she said, in the completely even tone of someone who is refusing to be moved more than they have already decided to be moved. She finished checking the mare, patted her once on the neck, and left the stable block. He stood in the quiet, in the morning light, and felt something that he had no recent reference for, something that was lighter than relief and larger than hope, and which he was not going to name yet, because naming it would require him to accept that he had found it in the last place he expected to look. He went back to the morning feed. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. Percy the horse pressed his nose against the stall gate and gave him a long, evaluating look. "Yes," Edward said to the horse. "I know. You had better judgment." Percy the horse appeared satisfied by this and went back to his hay. The carriage arrived at the main entrance of the Bellow estate on a Thursday morning, 11 days before the originally scheduled date, and Edward Voss descended from it dressed correctly for a duke, not extravagantly, not with the heavy ceremony of a man who needed his clothing to speak first, but in the particular, understated precision of a man who understood that quality and formality were not the same thing, and kept them carefully separate. He had spent 2 days in the village preparing for this. The time had been useful in ways he had not entirely expected. He had written a long letter to Aldous, the first fully honest one since the initial arrangement had been put in place, explaining the situation in its actual shape. He had asked Aldous to manage the formal side of the transition, to ensure the Below family received appropriate notice of the early arrival, to handle the protocol of the introduction, to be available if Lord Below's people had questions about the change in timeline. Aldous had responded with 2 sentences, the first of which acknowledged the situation, and the second of which said, "I will handle everything. Tell me when to come." He had also, in those 2 days in the village, sat with himself very deliberately, and made certain he was walking into the Bellow house, in possession of his own judgment. It would have been easy, at this point, to tip into the particular form of carelessness that followed relief, to decide that the difficult part was over, and coast forward on the momentum of what had happened in the stable yard. He did not allow himself that. He made himself think carefully about what he knew, and what he still did not know, and he arrived at the estate's main entrance, clear-eyed about both. What he knew: Constance Below was honest, capable, and possessed of a character that had withstood 11 days of close, unsentimental observation. He trusted her. He was not going to pretend otherwise or add qualifiers to it. What he did not yet know, whether the two of them, in a proper and formal setting, with all the pressures and expectations of both families and the whole weight of the arrangement present in the room, would find the same ease that had existed in a stable yard at 5 o'clock in the morning. Ease in private was not the same as ease under pressure. He had seen too many things that looked real in one light, and different in another, to assume that what he had observed would translate cleanly. He needed to see her in this context too. Not with the same scrutiny, that was done, and the results were in, but with genuine attention, because they were both different people, with their names and positions attached to them, and he needed to know that the people they were in public could also inhabit the same room. The housekeeper met him at the entrance, a composed woman in her 60s named Mrs. Aldridge, who managed the staff with the pleasant efficiency of someone who had done it long enough to find it natural. She led him to a sitting room that had been prepared for this meeting, a good-sized room with tall windows looking onto the south garden and furniture arranged for conversation rather than ceremony. He had been in a great many meeting rooms in his life. This one had been set up by someone who understood that the purpose of the furniture was to make people comfortable enough to be honest. That was, again, her work. He was sure of it. He sat and waited, and thought about nothing in particular, and watched the garden through the windows, which was carrying the last of the autumn color before the trees gave it up entirely. She came in from the hall door on the left, with her mother beside her, and a slight figure behind them, who he understood immediately must be her father. He stood. Lady Below came forward first, as was correct, and made the introduction with the warmth and care of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment, and was performing it with genuine effort. She said his name and title clearly, with the precise emphasis of someone who has been taught to give both their proper weight. She said how pleased they were to receive him. She said the estate was honored. He responded appropriately, warmly but not effortfully, and gave her the attention that she deserved for the very real work she was doing. Then he looked at Constance. She was looking at him, not with the morning yard directness. That particular quality was slightly modified, as she had said it would be, adjusted for the context of a formal introduction. But the essential quality of her attention was unchanged, present, focused, unapologetic. She did not pretend to be surprised. She gave him a look that was calibrated perfectly for a first meeting, polite, courteous, attentive, and in it, very precisely, the specific quality of someone who was maintaining a performance because she had agreed to, and was doing it with the same competence she brought to everything else. He almost smiled. He held it. "Lady Constance," he said, which was correct, and she said, "Your Grace," which was correct. And they shook hands the way two people meeting for the first time should, and the performance was entirely credible, and they both knew it was a performance, and neither of them said so, and it was, in its way, the most honest exchange he had had in a very long time. Then Lord Below extended his hand. He was a small man, slightly thinner than he had probably been when he was well, with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve his energy, because it was not unlimited. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes were sharp and clear, and Edward saw immediately what Constance had meant. He was sharper than people expected. He had the look of a man who had assessed a great many people over a long life, and had, through long practice, become extremely good at it. "My daughter tells me you arrived ahead of the scheduled time," Lord Below said. His voice was quieter than it had probably once been, but it was steady. He was making a statement, not a question, and the statement was, "I know this was not accidental." "I did," Edward said. "I hope the early arrival has not caused inconvenience." "None at all," Lord Below said, and the flicker in his eyes said plainly, "That is the correct response, and we will not speak of it further in this room." He had understood. He had chosen to allow it. That was Lord Below, a man who had been, before illness, a formidable manager of his estate, and who still retained the essential quality of that formidability, the ability to identify what needed saying and what needed only acknowledging, and to draw that line quietly and without fuss. Edward felt an unexpected thing: respect. Not the social acknowledgement of a title that could be performed, but the genuine kind, which came from recognizing someone as a person worth reckoning with. "I understand Bethany has recovered from her recent trouble," Lord Below said. He met the old man's eyes. "Completely," he said. "She was walking well this morning. The trouble was a small stone in the hoof that had been missed. Once it was removed, she was herself again, within a day." Lord Below nodded. Something in his face settled. The same quiet release of held tension that Edward had learned to recognize from his daughter. "She's a good horse," he said. 17 years old now. She was a difficult foal. Didn't take easily to being handled. But once she trusted you, she gave you everything." He said this looking at Edward, and Edward heard the layers in it, because he was listening for them. He was listening because he was the only person in the room who knew the full weight of what was being said. Lord Below was talking about a horse. He was also, with the specific intelligence of a man who had read the situation and reached his own conclusions, talking about something else entirely. "Once she trusted you, she gave you everything," Edward said. "I found that to be true." Lord Below looked at him for one more moment, then sat back in his chair and turned the conversation to the estate. He asked about Marienfeld, the land, the management, the crops, the state of the south pasture that he had apparently read about in some document at some point, and retained because that was the kind of person he was. Edward answered him honestly, with the specific knowledge of someone who managed his own land, and found it genuinely interesting. The conversation settled into the easy back and forth of two people who shared a practical interest in how things were run. Lady Below contributed graciously and occasionally. Constance sat slightly to the side and said very little. He was aware of her in the peripheral way that he had been aware of her in the stable, not watching directly, but attuned, knowing where she was and how she was carrying herself and what her silence meant. Her silence meant she was listening. He had learned that. Her silence was not absence. It was a very active kind of attention. At some point the conversation paused to allow tea, and Lady Below took advantage of the pause to steer things in the direction she had probably been steering toward since the beginning of the meeting, which was the social and practical dimensions of what a match between the two families might look like. She did this well, not aggressively, not clumsily, with the practiced ease of a woman who had been managing social situations for 30 years. He responded appropriately, which was to say, with warmth, and with the measured clarity of a man who was interested, but not already decided, because in the formal context, he was supposed to be meeting them for the first time. He caught Constance's eye at one point during this part of the conversation. Just briefly. She held it for exactly 1 second, and in that second was the faintest thing. Not quite amusement, more like a shared acknowledgement of the particular texture of the moment, a shared recognition of what was underneath the surface of everything being said. And then she was looking at her teacup and he was saying something appropriate to Lady below, and the moment was gone. It had taken less than a second, and communicated more than the rest of the conversation. At the end of the meeting, which lasted 2 hours, longer than he had expected but natural in its length, ending when Lord Below's energy began to quiet, the four of them stood, and there were handshakes, and the appropriate words, and an arrangement to continue the conversation the following day, which he agreed to, and which he genuinely wanted. At the door, Constance was behind him slightly as they moved toward the hall, and she said, at the exact right pitch, and the exact right distance, the kind of thing a woman might say upon parting with a new acquaintance, "I hope your rooms are comfortable." He turned and looked at her. Her expression was perfectly neutral. "I'm sure they will be," he said. She nodded and went back toward her father. He let himself out. In the front hall, before the housekeeper appeared to see him through, he stood alone for a moment in the clear autumn light and felt something that was complicated and specific, and not a thing he intended to rush past or manage. He had just met her, formally. He had just shaken hands with a woman he had spent 11 days in a stable yard with, and they had navigated a formal introduction in front of both their families, without anything falling apart, and she had done it with the same competence she brought to everything else, and he had done his part too, and it had worked. And now he needed to see her properly. Not as Wren, not in a formal meeting room, as himself, and as herself, outside the arrangement and outside the performance, in whatever version of the real world was available to them here. He stepped out through the front door and stood on the stone step for a moment, and breathed the cold autumn air, and thought, this is real now. Not an experiment, not a test, not a plan someone had arranged on both sides and neither side had fully known they were inside. It was real, and the next thing he needed to do was find out whether what had been real in the stable yard could survive in the light of day, when everything was what it actually was. He thought it probably could. He was aware that probably was not the same as certainly, but it was more than he had believed possible 6 months ago, and he intended to treat it with the care that it deserved. He walked back toward the guest house that Aldous had arranged, passing the south lane with the wide old oak trees, and noticed, as he walked beneath them, that they were still beautiful. He had thought that on the first morning, and he thought it now. Some things were simply what they were, regardless of who was looking at them or from what position or with what purpose. He was learning to find that steadying, rather than threatening. He was not entirely there yet, but he was much further than he had been. The second formal meeting was in the library, which had been Constance's suggestion, and which Edward suspected was deliberate. The main drawing room was where you managed impressions. The library was where you actually thought, and suggesting it said something about what she intended the meeting to be. He arrived at the agreed time and found the library empty. He spent a few minutes looking at the shelves, a good collection, well used, the books showing the particular signs of a library that was functional rather than decorative. The spines were worn at the right places. Several volumes had small slips of paper tucked in them. The shelving system made the kind of sense that came from someone who thought in categories rather than alphabetically, which was a specific and interesting form of mental organization. She arrived 7 minutes after the agreed time. Not late. He could hear from the hallway that she had been held up by something practical, a quick exchange with Croft about something that required a yes or a no, which she gave and moved on. She came into the library without any ceremony. "I'm sorry," she said. "Fence panel." "The east paddock?" he said. She stopped. Then, precisely, "How did you know?" "It was about to go when I was last in the yard," he said. "I mentioned it to Croft before I left." She looked at him for a moment, and it was the morning yard look, focused, direct, unguarded. The formal first meeting look had been left in the drawing room. They were back to being themselves, and the speed with which that happened settled something in him. "He fixed it this morning," she said. Good, he said. She sat in one of the chairs near the window. He sat in the other. They were at a diagonal rather than directly facing, which was the right arrangement for a conversation that was going to need to cover difficult ground. It allowed looking and not looking with equal ease. I want to ask you things, she said. Real things. Yes, he said. Not about the estate, not about the arrangement. About you. Yes, he said again. He meant it both times. She looked at him steadily. You're brothers, she said. I know the outline of what happened. What did it change in you? He considered the question. He had thought about his answer to this in the abstract for years, but he had never given it to a specific person in a specific room, and the doing of it was different from the thinking of it. It made me certain that trust had a cost, he said, and that the cost was not worth it unless the evidence was overwhelming. I spent 6 years looking for overwhelming evidence and finding it always just slightly insufficient. He paused. What it changed, functionally, was my threshold. I raised it to the point where almost nobody could clear it. And did that protect you? She asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. From the things I was afraid of, he said. Yes. From other things. Less so. He met her eyes. From being wrong about someone in the way Frederick and Philip were wrong, yes. From the particular loneliness of never being wrong about anyone, because I never let anyone close enough. No. She held his gaze. That's an honest answer. I'm trying to be honest, he said. It's newer for me than it should be. I know, she said, without any edge to it. Just acknowledgement. Now you, he said. What do you want to ask me that you couldn't ask in the drawing room? She thought for a moment. Do you actually want this? She said. Not the arrangement. I understand the arrangement and what it solves, and I'm not pretending it isn't real. I mean the actual thing. The years, the person. Is this something you want, or something you're prepared to accept because the evidence supports it? He felt the question the way he felt precise questions, like something being put into very sharp focus. He took the time it deserved. I want it, he said. I am also aware that I've known you for 13 days, counting from the morning in the stable, and that 13 days is not a long time. But I have not felt, in 13 years, not 13 days, the specific ease that I feel when I am talking to you, and I'm not willing to pretend that's not data. She was quiet for a moment. Ease, she said. Ease, he said. It's not a romantic word, but it's an honest one. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the same almost there thing he had seen in the yard. I know what you mean by it, she said. What about you? He said. Same question. She considered it with the same seriousness she brought to things that deserved it. Yes, she said. I want it. I also have concerns. Tell me the concerns, he said immediately. Please. She looked at the window for a moment. The estate, she said. I've been managing it for 4 years. If we marry, the formal management passes to you. That's the law, and I understand the law. But this estate has been in my family for 4 generations, and my father is not going to be here forever. And the idea of losing the practical connection to this place, of becoming a figure of the household rather than someone who actually makes decisions about the north field and the fence panel and the stable. She stopped. I am telling you something that most women in my position would not say out loud. I know, he said. Say it anyway. She looked back at him. I am not well suited to being decorative, she said. I am suited to being useful. If the arrangement requires me to become decorative, then the arrangement is not something I can do honestly. He heard every part of what she said. He had heard it, in fragments, over 11 days in the stable yard, but hearing it directly and completely, as a request rather than an observation, was a different and more significant thing. I have no interest in decorative, he said. I have one estate and a title, and a great deal of responsibility that would be considerably easier to carry if the person beside me could think and act clearly about things that matter. I have spent 6 years managing Marienfeld without someone to talk to about it honestly, and I know what that costs. He held her gaze. I want a partner. That is the actual word, not a social figure, or a hostess, or someone who makes the house look well for guests. A person who makes decisions alongside me, and who I can trust completely. She was very still. I told you in the stable yard that I trust you, he said. I meant it then, and I mean it now. What I'm asking you to trust in return is that I know what I'm saying. That's not a small ask. I understand that. No, she said. It isn't a small ask. A pause. Outside the library window, the garden was moving in a mild wind, the last leaves pulling free from the oak nearest the path and drifting across the lawn in a slow, unhurried way that had nothing to do with anything either of them was feeling. My father likes you, she said finally. He blinked. The shift was unexpected, and he had not expected the shift to matter as much as it immediately did. Does he? He told me this morning, she said. He said you knew what you were talking about when you talked about land, and that you listened when he talked, and that you didn't try to impress him. She looked at him. He said, he listens. That was the specific thing he said. Edward thought about Lord Below in the drawing room the day before, asking about the south pasture with the precise attention of someone who was going to remember the answer. He thought about sitting across from a man who was ill and tired and still sharp, and listening genuinely, because it was interesting, and because the man was worth listening to. He's very easy to listen to, Edward said. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression he had not seen from her before. Something that was warmer than any of the careful neutral expressions she had shown him in the formal settings, and not quite contained. Then she arranged it and said, he asked me whether the stone was found on the first morning or the first afternoon. Edward went very still. I told him the first morning, she said, before 6 o'clock. He nodded, and didn't say anything else. A pause. He didn't need to. Lord Below knew. He did not know the full story. He did not know about Wren, or the false name, or the 11 days of covert observation, but he knew that the man sitting across from him in the drawing room had been in his stable before 6 in the morning on the first day, doing work that nobody had asked him to do, for a horse that could not ask for help. He knew that, and he had drawn the same conclusion his daughter had drawn, with the same quiet efficiency of a person who had spent a lifetime reading the difference between what people did when they were observed and what they did when they were not. He's a good judge of people, Edward said. The best I know, she said, and in the words was everything. The love, the worry, the particular grief of a person watching someone they loved become smaller than they used to be, and the fierce, steady determination not to let that be the whole story. They sat in the library for 2 more hours. They talked about Marienfeld, the specifics, the land, the staff, the problems, and the seasons, and the things he had not managed as well as he should have, and the things he was proud of. She asked questions that were intelligent and specific, the questions of someone who understood estate management from the inside, and was assessing what she was being told with real knowledge. He answered her without managing the answers, without shaping them toward a better impression. She noticed when he did not manage them. He could tell. There was a specific quality of attention that she gave things she was receiving as honest rather than performed. He learned, in those 2 hours, things about her that the 11 days in the stable had not taught him. He learned that she had a specific and unexpected gift for pattern recognition. She could hear a sequence of events and identify the structural cause very quickly, without apparent effort, the way a musician hears a false note. He learned that she had a sense of humor that surfaced very occasionally, in very specific contexts, and that when it appeared, it was dry and precise, and slightly devastating. He learned that she read widely, more widely than the estate library suggested, which was already wide, and that the things she read informed her thinking in ways she did not separate from her practical decisions. He also learned, in those 2 hours, the thing that mattered most. He learned what she was like when she disagreed with him. It happened twice. Once about the best approach to restoring depleted soil. She held a different view than he did, one that was informed by different reading and different experience, and she stated it plainly, and without softening it, and explained her reasoning, and did not back away from it when he challenged it. He challenged it twice, and the second time she said, "You might be right, but I don't think so yet. I'd want to see the numbers from Marienfeld before I changed my position." He said, "Fair," and it was. The second time was about the question of what to do with the Bellow estate's financial situation in the immediate term, what the fastest path to stability was, given what a potential arrangement would and would not cover. She disagreed with his proposed approach, clearly, with specific reasons, and then said, "I may be wrong. I have less visibility into the overall financial picture than you do. If you'll share the full picture, I can give you a better assessment. He shared the full picture. She sat with it for several minutes, going through the numbers she had not had access to before. Then she said, I was wrong about the timeline. You're right, it's faster the way you said. She said it without any difficulty. Not easily, because it was not easy to change a position in front of someone, but without difficulty, which meant without the kind of ego that made changing a position feel like a loss. He watched this and thought, that is the most important thing I have learned today. Not the agreement, the disagreement, and the recovery from it, and the lack of difficulty. That was the thing that lasted. He had known people who were warm, and people who were capable, and people who were honest. He had rarely known all three in the same person, and he had never, not once, in 31 years, known someone who disagreed with him clearly, admitted when they were wrong, and moved forward from both with exactly the same composure. When the meeting ended, it was past midday. They had not noticed the time passing, which was itself information. She walked him to the library door, and they stood for a moment in the doorway, the way you stand, when a conversation is over, but neither person has found the exact right point to end it. Tomorrow, he said. I'd like to speak with your father, properly, if he's willing. He will be, she said. She paused. He asked this morning whether you intended to stay until the original scheduled date, or leave and return. I'd like to stay, he said, if that's acceptable. She looked at him with the morning yard look. Yes, she said. It's acceptable. A pause. The stable hands will find it strange if you suddenly stop appearing in the yard. He heard the thing underneath the words. He had not expected it. He felt it arrive and settle somewhere specific. I'll make sure to be there tomorrow morning, he said. Early, she said, with the perfectly neutral tone she used for things that were not neutral at all. Before 6, he said. She nodded once, as if this settled a practical question, and went back into the library. He stood in the hall for a moment, and breathed, and felt the very specific quality of something that was no longer uncertain. Not in the large sense, not in the final sense. There was still a great deal to be decided and agreed and structured and arranged. But in the essential sense, the sense that mattered before anything else could matter, he knew. And she knew. And they had come to that knowledge by different routes, and arrived at exactly the same place. He walked back through the house, through the hall, out the front door, down the stone step, and along the south lane, beneath the wide old oaks, and the trees were exactly what they had always been, and he thought, yes, this is what real things feel like. I had forgotten. He had 11 more days to remember. The conversation with Lord Below happened the following afternoon, in the old man's private sitting room, and it was the most honest conversation Edward had had with a parent, any parent, his own included, in his adult life. Lord Below was in the chair by the window. He had a blanket across his knees, not because the room was cold, it was warm, carefully kept, but because he had reached the stage of his illness where the cold lived inside him, and he carried it, regardless of the room's temperature. He was reading when Edward was shown in, and he set the book aside without marking the page, which suggested he had not been especially absorbed in it. Sit down, Lord Below said, and do me the courtesy of speaking plainly, because I find the elaborate version of conversations tiring at my age. Edward sat. I'll do my best, he said. Tell me about your brothers, Lord Below said. He said it without preamble, without softening, as a man who had identified the essential question and was going straight to it. Edward told him. Not the social version, not the carefully managed account he had given a few times over the years, in conversations with people who were asking because they needed to place the history somewhere and be done with it. He told him the genuine version, Frederick's marriage, and what he had watched happen inside it, and the lesson he had drawn. Philip's marriage, and what that had done to Philip, and the lesson he had drawn from that too. He told it plainly, the way Lord Below had asked him to, and he did not explain the conclusions or justify them. He just gave the man the facts. Lord Below listened without interrupting. When Edward finished, the old man was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a bird was doing something energetic in the garden. And so you came here to look before you would commit, Lord Below said. It was not a question. Yes, Edward said. Dressed as a working man, Lord Below said, with the exact tone of a person who has known this for some time, and has decided how he feels about it. Yes, Edward said. Lord Below looked at him steadily. I know Croft, he said. I've known him for 20 years. I know when Croft is managing a thing on someone else's instructions. I noticed it when you arrived. He paused. I said nothing to Constance at the time. I suspected she would arrive at the truth herself. She did, Edward said, before I told her. Lord Belleau nodded, once, as if this confirmed what he had expected. She's sharp, he said, without pride. Just as a fact, the same way you state that the sky is a particular color. She's been sharp since she was very young. It has occasionally been inconvenient. The faintest, driest thread of something in the words. My wife hoped she would learn to be slightly less so. She did not learn this. I'm glad she didn't, Edward said. Lord Belleau looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be a deliberate assessment. Then, so am I, he said. I'll tell you something that I haven't told Constance, because she doesn't need the additional weight. When I began to understand the difficulty the estate was in, the real difficulty, not the version I managed to present to most people, my first instinct was to find a solution quickly. Marriages of arrangement have been the solution to this kind of difficulty for a long time. There was nothing unusual about the category of the problem or the approach to solving it. He paused. But I had a concern. What concern? Edward said. Constance, Lord Belleau said simply. I can arrange a match that solves the estate's problem, but I cannot arrange a match that makes Constance into someone she isn't. And Constance is not someone who does well in situations where she is required to be less than herself. I have watched her manage this estate for 4 years. I have watched what it costs her and what it gives her. She is someone who needs to be used well. He said it the way you said something that was not a weakness, but a specific quality that required the right conditions to function. If I arranged her into a situation where she was not used well, I would have solved one problem and created a permanent one. Edward said, I understand. Do you? Lord Belleau said, not challengingly, genuinely. I spent 11 days watching her, Edward said. I watched her manage a delivery dispute, a depleted Northfield, a supplier who needed correcting, a mayor with a hidden problem, and a visitor who came to remind her of how vulnerable her position was. I watched her do all of it, without losing anything essential about herself. I understand what she is. He met the old man's eyes. I've been looking for someone I could trust completely. I found her, but the specific luck of it, the thing I didn't plan for, is that what I found is also someone who I would have to be better for. Not perform better. Actually be better. Lord Belleau was quiet. I've been careful for 6 years, Edward said. Careful in a way that protected me from the things I was afraid of, and from a great deal else besides. She doesn't allow that carefulness to go unchallenged, and I find, rather than resenting that, I'm relieved by it. Lord Belleau looked at the window for a moment. The bird in the garden had moved on. The garden was still and golden in the afternoon light. She will run the thing honestly, the old man said. It was not a question, and not a prediction. It was a statement of what he knew about his daughter. Whatever is agreed, she will run it honestly. Should know that going in. If something is not right, she will say so. She doesn't have a mechanism for pretending otherwise. Good, Edward said. It is good, Lord Belleau said. It is also occasionally uncomfortable. I expect that, Edward said. You think you do, Lord Belleau said, with the mildest and most precise edge Edward had heard from anyone in recent memory. You will find that expecting it and experiencing it are different. Probably, Edward agreed. Lord Belleau looked at him again, with the long, assessing look. Then something shifted very slightly in his expression. Something that was not warmth exactly, too contained for that, but something that was closer to warmth than what had preceded it. She has been carrying a great deal, he said. For several years. She has not complained, and she has not asked for anyone to make it easier. She simply carries it. He was looking at the window again. I would like, before I am no longer here to see it, to know that what she is carrying has been made lighter. The room was quiet. The afternoon light was precise and clear through the window, the particular quality of autumn light that illuminated things without warming them. Edward said, I intend to make it lighter. He said it as a statement of intention rather than a promise, because he was not a man who made promises he was not certain he could keep, and the future was never certain. But the intention was real. He felt it the way he felt things that were genuinely true, without performance, without the slight self-consciousness of a statement being made for effect. He meant it, and the meaning was in the quality of it. and Lord below heard that. "Good," the old man said. He reached for his book. "You can send Aldridge in when you go. I need tea." Edward stood. Of course. He moved toward the door. Then, because it was true, and because the old man deserved to hear it, "Bethany is in very good form. She was at the gate this morning when I went past." Lord Bellow looked up. The something not quite warmth was back, more present this time. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Edward left him to his book, and his tea, and his quiet afternoon, and stood for a moment in the hallway outside the closed door, and thought about carrying things. About what it looked like when someone carried something for a very long time without putting it down, and what it looked like when someone else saw it and decided, on their own and without being asked, to stand next to them and take some of the weight. He found Aldridge, and passed on the message about the tea. Then he put his coat on, and went out into the garden, because he needed air, and because the afternoon light on the south garden was the specific quality of beautiful that required no context, and no analysis, just a willingness to stand in it. He was there when Constance came out from the east side door, which was the door closest to the kitchen, and which she used when she was on estate business, rather than when she was being the daughter of the house. She saw him across the garden, and changed her direction only slightly, moving toward him rather than past him, which was its own quiet statement. She came to stand near him. She did not look at him immediately. She looked at the garden the way she looked at things she was genuinely considering. "How was it?" she said. "Good," he said. "Honest." She nodded. "He said he wanted to speak to you plainly." He did. And? He thought about the conversation, what to share, and what to hold as private, what belonged to the space between himself and her father, and what could be brought out into the autumn light. He said, "He told me she doesn't have a mechanism for pretending otherwise, when something isn't right." She was quiet for a moment. "That's accurate," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm planning on it." She looked at him then, with the morning yard look, present, focused, honest. It was the look she gave things she was taking seriously, and he had learned to receive it without flinching. "There's something I want to say," she said. "Yes," he said. "The first morning," she said, "when you found the stone in Bethany's hoof, I didn't see it happen. I just saw the result. The leg was better, and you were there, and you had done it." She paused. "I've been thinking about that. About the fact that you came into this place with an agenda, a real and specific agenda, and still, at 5 o'clock in the morning, with no reason to do it except that it was there to be done, you did the right thing for an animal that needed it." He waited. "I think that's who you actually are," she said, "underneath the architecture of the plan." He held that for a moment, not because it required holding, he heard it clearly, but because it was the thing he had been most uncertain about himself, about whether the person he had been in the stable yard under a false name was actually him, or was him in favorable conditions, or was him performing something he wanted to be, and not quite being it yet. "I think it might be," he said. "I'm not certain I've had the chance to find out. I've been quite careful for a long time." "I know," she said. "I can tell." Not unkindly, with the precision she brought to honest observations. "Does it concern you?" he asked. She considered. "No," she said. "Caution isn't a character flaw. It's just a setting. Settings can change." A pause. "Mine have." "What do you mean?" he said. "I came into this arrangement expecting something specific," she said. "I had told myself what to expect, and prepared myself for it. I expected a duke with a title, and a fortune, and an assessment to make, and I expected to be one of the things being assessed." She was looking at the garden again. "I didn't expect Wren. I didn't expect someone who was interested in what the horses were telling him, and who had an opinion about soil rotation, and who sat with Bethany for an hour when she was withdrawn, just because she was withdrawn and it seemed like the right thing to do." He was very still. "The arrangement was already decided, on my end," she said, "before you arrived. I had made my peace with it, and I intended to go forward honestly, and see what could be built." She turned and looked at him. "Then I met you, not the Duke. You. And what I found was more than I was prepared for." He felt the words the way you feel something after a long cold period, when warmth finally arrives. Not dramatically, not with any performance. Just a deep, specific relief that went all the way to the place inside you that had been cold. More than prepared for, he said. More, she said, simply, and did not elaborate, because she was who she was, and elaboration was not her particular form of expression. He said, I'd like to stay until the original date. Not as a guest, as someone actually present here. In the yard in the mornings. At the table in the evenings. In whatever the actual life of this place is. She looked at him. That's an unusual request for a duke. I'm aware, he said. You've already spent 11 days as a groom, she pointed out, with the slight dry precision that was her version of humor. I found it useful, he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not the almost smile. Something more complete than that. It arrived and stayed, brief and real, and then settled into the quiet steadiness that was her default. All right, she said. Stay. Owen and Will be relieved. They've been confused about where you went. What did Croft tell them? He said. That you were reassigned to the main house, she said, which is technically accurate. He looked at her. She was already turning back toward the east door, done with the conversation in the completed way she ended things. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that was different from the usual. Something lighter than the usual. He was not going to remark on it. He was just going to note it. Tomorrow at 5, he said. She paused at the door. I'll have Croft leave the gate unlocked, she said, and went inside. He stood in the garden for another minute. The afternoon light was still doing what afternoon autumn light does, which is to make everything look briefly better than it normally is, and slightly more worth keeping. He looked at the south lane with the old oaks. He looked at the stable block visible at the far end of the yard. He looked at the house, which was a good house in the specific sense of being a place where real things had happened to real people, and left marks in the wood and stone and air that were still present. He thought, there are 11 days left. They are not a test. They are not an arrangement. They are simply days, available to be lived, in a place that already feels more like somewhere he belongs than anywhere has felt in a long time. He put his collar up against the autumn cold and walked back toward the guest house. The last 11 days were different from the first 11. He was in the yard before 5:30 every morning, and nobody found this strange anymore. Owen had decided, after a brief period of working it out, that the Duke was simply the kind of man who liked animals and early mornings, and since both of those things were true, Owen had filed it under understandable and moved on. Will accepted it without any internal filing process at all, which was perhaps the more sensible approach. Croft maintained the precise neutrality he had maintained throughout, which Edward had come to understand as Croft's version of approval. What changed was the quality of the time. In the first 11 days he had been watching, always, with the particular attention of someone who was gathering evidence toward a conclusion. He had been present in the body, and slightly absent in himself, one part of him always observing, cataloging, assessing. That mode had served its purpose, and he had let it go. What replaced it was simpler and stranger. He was just there. Present in the morning, doing the work, talking when there was something worth saying, and not talking when there wasn't. The conversations changed as a result. Not in form. They were still the short, practical exchanges of two people moving through the early work of a day. But in substance, they went further. He told her about Marienfeld in the way you tell someone about a place you love, not to impress, not to inventory, but because the details mattered, and she was a person who cared about details and knew what to do with them. She told him things about the Below estate that she had not told him in the first 11 days, things that were specific to the knowledge you had, only when you had been somewhere long enough to understand it, not just manage it. She told him about the West Garden, which her mother maintained and which had a specific section of climbing roses that had been planted by her grandmother, and which died back every winter, in a way that always looked permanent, and then came back every spring, in a way that still surprised everyone who saw it happen, even after years of witnessing it. She told him that her father, in a good year before his health deteriorated, had made a habit of reading in the garden every morning from June to September, and that she had grown up understanding the rhythm of a household as something partly determined by one person's very specific preferences about where to sit. He told her about his own father, who had died when Edward was 24, and whom he had not had enough time with, and had not fully understood until several years after. He told her that his father had been a quiet man who solved problems slowly and thoroughly, and who had never made a dramatic decision in his life, which meant the estate he inherited was in excellent shape, and there were no dramatic stories to tell about it, and the absence of drama was, he had come to understand, its own form of love. He had not told anyone this before. He had said it to her in the horse yard at 7 in the morning, while Percy the horse conducted his fence audit, and she had listened, with the quality of attention she gave things that mattered, and then she had said, "Your father sounds like the kind of person who improves the places he moves through." He had not known how to respond to that. He had said, "Yes, I think that's right," and she had nodded, and they had gone back to the work, and he had carried the words with him for the rest of the day, and found them still present in the evening, which was a quality of words he did not encounter often. He met Lord Below twice more in the following days, formally and informally. The formal meeting was an arranged dinner, the four of them, which Lady Below organized with the particular precision she brought to social occasions, and which went well in the smooth, careful way that well-organized dinners went, when the people at the table were genuinely interested in each other, rather than performing interest. The informal meeting was unplanned. He was crossing the hall on the third day, on his way from somewhere to somewhere else, and Lord Below was making one of his rare appearances outside his sitting room, moving slowly toward the library with a book under his arm. They walked together for the length of the hall, which was not long, and Lord Below said only two things. The first was, "The North Field." "Constance mentioned you had a view about the rotation." Edward said, "I do. She disagrees with part of it." Lord Below said, "She's probably right about the part she disagrees with." And then they parted at the library door, and Edward continued to wherever he had been going, and felt the pleasure of that exchange for the rest of the morning. The second thing Lord Below had said was at the library door, turning back with one hand on the frame. "My daughter does not often say she was wrong. When she says it, she means it." A pause. "And she does not often say she was right either. When she is right and says nothing, she is usually waiting to see if you arrive at it yourself." He said this with the air of a man passing on information that was useful to have. Then he went into the library and closed the door. Edward stood in the hall for a moment. Then he smiled. Not the controlled, social version, but the real one, which felt slightly unfamiliar, because it came from somewhere he did not manage. He went back to whatever he had been doing. On the 5th of the remaining days, Aldous arrived. He came quietly, by arrangement, to handle the formal paperwork of the proposal, and to be present for the documentation that an arrangement of this kind required. He was a small, neat man, with sharp eyes behind thin spectacles, and he had served the Voss family for long enough to have known Edward as a child, which gave him the particular authority of someone who understood the person behind the title, in ways that most of Edward's world did not. Aldous sat across from him at the table in the guest house on the morning of his arrival, and looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. "You look different," Aldous said. "I know," Edward said. "Better or worse?" Aldous asked, in the tone of a man who was asking a practical question, not a flattering one. "Better," Edward said. "I think." "Good," Aldous said. He opened his case. "Let's deal with the formal side." The formal side was handled over the next 2 days, with Aldous' customary efficiency, and Edward did not need to be heavily involved, because Aldous understood this particular kind of arrangement better than almost anyone. What Edward was involved in was the conversation with Constance about the terms, not the legalities which Aldous would manage, but the actual shape of what they were building. They had this conversation in the library, which had become their natural space. Not by any explicit arrangement, it had simply happened that when there was something real to discuss, they went to the library, and the library had begun to feel like the specific room where Honestly lived in the house. The terms that mattered to him, the practical management of both estates, was to be collaborative. He was explicit about this, and he had Aldous draw it up in the documentation in a way that was formal and clear, because formality and clarity were the things that protected intentions from the erosion of time and circumstance. Her voice and decisions about Below, in perpetuity, not contingent on his goodwill, but structural. Her voice and decisions about Marenfeld, too, because he had told her father he wanted a partner, and he had meant the word precisely. The terms that mattered to her. Her father was to remain in his house for the rest of his life, regardless of the estate's formal ownership. The North Field was to be handled according to her proposed rotation, not his, since she was right, and he had spent 2 days confirming it. The gray mare Bethany was to remain in the Bellows stable for the duration of her life, because she was 17 and had been her father's horse since she was a foal and did not need to be moved. He agreed to all of it immediately, which startled her. He could see it. She had been prepared to argue, had arranged her arguments, and found herself not needing them. "No counter?" she said. "No," he said. "You're right about the rotation, and the horse should stay. The rest is simply correct." She looked at him for a moment, and he saw that she was recalibrating, not because she doubted him, but because she was the kind of person who took a moment when things matched her expectations, less dramatically than she had prepared for. "All right," she said. "There's one thing I want to add," he said. "Yes?" "The conversation with your father," he said. "When I told him I intended to make things lighter, I want you to know I said that, and I meant it, and I'm aware that intending something and doing it are different. I'm not going to manage you or protect you from things that you don't need protecting from, but there are things you've been carrying alone, and I'd like to carry them alongside you." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I told your father in private, and I should have told you directly." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her receive it, not performing a response, not managing her reaction, simply letting it land. "He told me," she said, "not what you said exactly, but that you had said something that needed saying." She looked at him. "He doesn't give that description often." "I noticed he's careful with it," Edward said. "Very," she said. She looked at the window. The garden was visible, the climbing roses bare now, their canes dark against the stone wall. "My mother thinks this has all gone very well, very quickly," she said. "She's slightly worried that it's gone too easily." "What do you think?" he said. She turned back to him. "I think some things are hard because they're complicated," she said. "And some things are hard because they're difficult to face. And some things are actually just clear. And the clarity is what makes them seem simple. And simple isn't the same as easy." He held that for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." She nodded, as if the agreement confirmed something, and moved on. That was how she moved through things. She arrived at them, understood them, placed them somewhere appropriate, and continued. He was learning to trust the speed of it. She was not superficial, she was efficient. They were different things. The day before the arranged conclusion of his visit, the day the formal documentation was to be signed, which Aldous had prepared with his usual meticulous thoroughness, Constance came to find him in the stable at mid-morning. He was not doing anything especially important, just checking on Bethany, who was in excellent form and clearly did not need checking on, but who he checked on anyway, because she was a good horse, and because he had come to enjoy standing in her stall and finding her well. Constance came in from the yard entrance and stood at the gate of the stall. She looked at the mare for a moment. "She likes you," she said. "She tolerates me," he said. "She likes you." "There's a difference," she agreed. She leaned on the gate, watching the mare, who was watching her with the fond attention of an animal that knows exactly who loves her best. "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," he said. "Wren," she said. He waited. "That person, who arrived here 6 weeks before he should have, with a bag and borrowed boots and no particular plan beyond watching. I liked him, specifically, not as a version of you, as a person in his own right." She paused. "I want you to know that. Because I think there's a risk, going forward, that the title takes up more space than the person, and I don't want that to happen." He considered this seriously, because she was being serious. "I don't want it to happen either," he said. "The title is a fact. It changes how rooms feel when I walk into them, and it changes what people say to me, and it changes what I'm able to do practically, and I can't and wouldn't dismiss any of that. But it isn't who I am. It's what I have. Most people in your position don't maintain that distinction," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been trying to, for a long time, with varying success. It's easier to maintain when the people around me don't collapse the two." She looked at him. "I won't collapse them," she said. It was a statement of intention, the same clear, unelaborated kind she made when something mattered. She did not dramatize things that were important, she stated them. "I know," he said. "That's one of the reasons we're here." She pushed off the gate and straightened, The document signing is tomorrow at 10, she said. I know, he said. Aldous will be insufferably thorough, she said. He always is, Edward said. He's been insufferably thorough for 30 years, and it has served the family well. She looked at him with the dry, precise thing that was her version of humor. My own advisor is named Perch, she said. He's been with our family for 22 years, and he has never once told me something I didn't want to hear, in a way that made it easier to receive. I look forward to meeting him, Edward said. You'll find him trying, she said. He'll find you presumptuous. We'll manage, he said. She turned to go. At the stable entrance she stopped, which was not her usual movement. She usually turned away, and was gone, the conversation complete in her mind, before she had fully left the room. She stopped, and turned back. My mother asked me last night whether I was happy about this, she said. He waited. I told her I was, she said. She pressed me for more than that, because she wanted more than that, and I told her, I find the actual person beneath the arrangement, and the person is someone I can be honest with. For me, that's the most important version of happy. She turned and went back into the yard, and he stood in the stable with Bethany's warm breath against his shoulder and thought about the most important version of happy. He thought about it for a long time. He thought about Frederick, who had wanted warmth and found performance. He thought about Philip, who had wanted partnership and found dissolution. He thought about himself, 6 years ago, sitting in the study in Marienfeld, with Aldous' letter in his hand, reading the words, Lady Constance below, sole heir, and feeling only the familiar tightening that came with risk, and the familiar resolve to approach it with the maximum available caution. He thought about the stone in the hoof, and the fence post in the north corner, and the look on her face the second before she rearranged it when Gable left the yard. He thought about the library, and the morning hours, and the conversation at the water trough, and the specific quality of her silence when she was receiving something real. He thought about Lord Below saying, once she trusted you, she gave you everything. He thought about her saying, at the gate of the east paddock, in the autumn light, and you did. Bethany pushed her nose more firmly against his shoulder, as if reminding him that she was present, and the stall was warm, and the hay was excellent, and whatever complicated thoughts he was having were his own business, but she was available for company if he wanted it. You're right, he told her. I'm overthinking it. The mayor appeared to find this satisfactory. He gave her a last pat, closed the stall carefully, and walked back out into the yard. The morning had progressed while he had been inside. The sun was up fully now. The frost burned off the grass. The estate moving through its middle morning work with the efficiency of a well-run place, which it was, because she had been running it well for 4 years, and it showed in everything. He stopped for a moment at the center of the yard and looked at it, the stable block to his left, the main house ahead, the south lane to his right with the oaks, Croft's office window with the light on, Owen and Will at the far fence, the smell of the morning, and the horses, and the last of the autumn before winter arrived. He thought, I am going to know this yard for the rest of my life. He thought, that is not a small thing, and I am not going to treat it as one. He walked toward the house to find Aldous and discuss the documents, because there was work to do, and the work was where the real things happened, and he had learned that from her, and he intended to carry it forward. Percy the horse watched him go from the paddock gate, ears forward, opinion unshared. The document was signed the following morning at 10, with Aldous on one side and Perch on the other, both of them insufferable and thorough in their respective ways, which was exactly what they were paid to be. Lord Below was present in a chair by the window, less for the formal requirement than because he wanted to be there, and Edward thought that was entirely right. Lady Below was present and composed, and had clearly been waiting for this moment for a long time, and received it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has managed something difficult all the way to its conclusion. Constance signed her name in the same clear, unelaborated way she did everything. Then she looked up, and he was looking at her, and the room was full of other people doing important things with papers, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." It was the same exchange they had had every morning for weeks, in the stable yard before 6 o'clock, with the horses moving behind them, and the day still dark, and the world still quiet. It meant exactly the same thing now that it had meant then, maybe more. Outside the window, the garden sat in the clear morning light, the climbing roses bare, the oaks along the south lane wide and unhurried. Everything exactly as it had been the morning he arrived, with a bag over his shoulder, and a plan that had worked out almost nothing like he intended. The thing about plans, he had been learning, was that the ones worth keeping were not the ones that went as designed. They were the ones that got interrupted by something more honest than the original intention, and held up anyway. He had come looking for something he could trust. He had found it in the way you found things you were not entirely prepared to find. Suddenly, completely, in a stable at 5 in the morning, in the presence of a mare named Bethany, and a woman who asked the right question, and waited quietly to hear the honest answer. It was enough. It was more than enough. He was going to spend a long time finding out exactly how much more.